You were incorrect when you said that you were unaware of any example in history where an administration has gone after an official from the other party.
I said, not that I know of, I'm unsure.
Okay, will you admit now that you're incorrect?
That an administration, okay, hold on. This requires clarification, right?
All right, yeah, that's it. So just set the stage. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing your name. Devon, is that right? Am I putting the accent in the right spot? Okay, Devon.
So it's Devon. So the emphasis is on the second syllable, but
gotcha.
Yeah, Devon.
Devon. Yeah. Okay. Devon and I talked during the one Sarah Tomato panel where I was sort of the guest, and my whole point was that we should sort of mock and ignore Democrats' criticisms of Trump if they have defended things in the past that were similar to what they're criticizing Trump with. And Devon came on and was one of the panelists that came on afterwards, and we were talking, and there was sort of a conversation that I hand waved away, which I still feel like hand waving away, I'll be honest, but we'll see where it goes, about Trump's personality, his character, etc. And so afterwards, we agreed to set up a longer discussion about it. So there wasn't really like a predefined debate topic. It's not like I'm going to be arguing, I'm defending all of Trump's character, and you're going to be arguing against it. It was just sort of, that was the impetus for this conversation. So is it anything you want to add, or you think that's a fair summary of what happened?
A decent summary. That's basically a good summary of what happened. I think I just want to like clarify what I mean by that. I'm not saying like, like Trump's like mean or whatever, because like that's, at the end of the day, that's just, I feel like that's a weak argument, and I feel like I fought up a lot of people like that are further to my left about stupid stuff like that. It's more so just an analysis of how character bleeds into actions and policy and the way that people handle them in a position of leadership. And I think that for the most part, I think that you'd agree that character has an effect on the way that you feel people are going to approach things, because I've seen you react that way in the past.
Okay, so let's do this. Obviously, I want you to outline your case of what you exactly mean by Trump's characters and what you think the flaws are. But before we get to that point, I guess it would be prudent to say, if we have a disagreement on this, because when it comes to conversations of character and other things of that nature, it's going to be subjective. For example, we could each meet the same third person at a party, and you could be like, I think that person's a selfish asshole. And I could be like, actually, I think they were just being funny. Right? There's some amount of subjectiveness towards it. So how will we judge who's right? Would it be fair to say that we should judge his character based on sort of the policies that he's implemented in his first term and his second term?
Well, I guess the question is, do you think that there are certain character traits that are like, there are some that we could probably say are more broad and like have room for interpretation, but there are some character traits, or at least the way that people carry out those character traits, that there's probably going to be some large intersubjectivity when we actually look at it. Like someone who's vindictive, it's somewhat easier for people to come to the same conclusion about someone being vindictive, given the facts of the matter, right? Like, I don't think there's too much room for interpretation for certain characters.
Fair enough, and we could delve into that. I guess the point that I would be, let me clarify, I guess, what I'm saying. Sure. Even if I come away thinking Trump's a huge piece of shit, if I think he's doing a good job with the policies that he's instituting, why would I care? It seems to me that incumbent upon you criticizing Trump's character, there would have to be what we would call in debate an impact to that. So I don't give a shit if he's like a swarthy guy or if he's a cheater, if he's running the country in a good direction. So where your argument be, his character flaws are causing him to run the country in a bad direction?
I would say his character flaws are causing him to act in certain ways when it comes to how he approaches policy, rather than the actual policy itself, how he approaches it, how he walks them back, how he decides what he's going to do, and who he decides he's going to do it to.
Okay, so let's say then, maybe this will help illustrate, and I promise I'm going to give you a chance to discuss all what you think of his character
I believe
flaws.
you, bro.
but this is where I'm coming from. Let's look at a hypothetical. Let's say that there was a person who's like one of your best friends or something, or like your, a parent or a brother or sister, whatever, just someone you really respect. And let's say we could look in a crystal ball and it could be them being president or Trump. And in that crystal ball, I said, look, this person that you could vouch for their character, and I believe you, their character's high caliber, one of the nicest people in the world, would do anything for you, but they ran the country like shit. And Trump's got terrible character. He's vindictive, he's petty, he's an asshole, but the country's running much better. Why in that world would I give a shit about character when it comes to the person that's the president running the country?
In that world, if you have the choice between someone who is of like fine moral character, or someone I can vouch for this fine moral character, but runs the country like shit, and you have someone who is Trump, who has bad character, but runs the country fine. If those are the only two choices, you shouldn't give a shit. You should definitely choose Trump in that sense. However, I think that when I'm looking at this, I would say that I would not choose the person who, in reality, there's more than just those two people, right? So I wouldn't choose the person who I would vouch for, who has moral character, that runs the country like shit, because it's important that regardless of your character, you're running the country well. With Trump in particular, and we may have some disagreement on the way that he's running the country, but for me personally, and a lot of the people who are criticizing him, it's not a matter of us just saying he's mean. It's a matter of us seeing those character flaws and it bleeding down into the way he acts and the way that those policies come through, the way he approaches them.
So I'll just explain for a second how I think of things. Maybe it's a little different than the average person, because I did policy debate in college. We learned to think in arguments like in steps. So, for example, this is just a basic crash course. There is 3, or I guess you could say 3.5, 4 steps to an argument. The first would be uniqueness, the way things are. The economy is good. The second would be the link, how what you're proposing would change things. So my plan would harm the economy. The third is what we call an internal link. That's just a link between the link and the impact. And the fourth is impact. Impact is ultimately why that matters. I feel like what you're citing is what I would call an internal link. Trump's poor character, but what's the impact? And if the impact would be it causes him to run the country poorly. Now, the reason that matters to me is when I first talked to you, what happens is if we just have this discussion about characteristics, etc., one, I don't give a shit about those things when it comes to governance. I care about the end result. If we get there because this guy's petty, or if we get there because this guy's like the nicest, biggest, hardest person in the world, that matters very little to me as much as the outcome. That's what I'm concerned with. But there's going to be subjective disagreements, and it's hard for us to evaluate like sort of our subjective nature of whose character is better, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or Donald Trump or Nikki Haley, or someone that may have ran. So instead, I would look at the outcomes. What does the outcomes look like that this guy has led to? And I feel like your conversation is going to lead more towards that internal link. And I don't think that matters much. Now, I'll give you an example. You might say a characteristic that Trump has is vindictiveness. And we could see normally people that are vindictive would govern very poorly. And let's say I concede that, and I say maybe that is true most of the time. However, what that is an internal link. We already have the impact. We could already evaluate how Trump's governing. So we don't need to look at his characteristics to say, how did we get here? We know we're here. So the debate should be, is it governing good or is it governing poorly? Another example I could give you of this is conversations about diversity. People will say things like diversity matters, but in what context? What are you talking about? If you mean diversity of thought, well, yeah, you might say, how do we get diversity of thought? Maybe people of different ethnicities, people of different religions, people of different biological sexes. But if I gave you a group of 10 people that were a rainbow, some were gay, some straight, some Christian, some Muslim, some atheist, some white, some black, some men, some women, and they all thought exactly the same, the internal link of we assume that there's a better chance of them having diverse thought. What does it matter? Because we know the outcome and there isn't diverse thought. That's ultimately where I'm going to come down in this conversation. We could certainly, you can have the opportunity to talk about all of Trump's character flaws you want. I just don't give a shit. I don't care at all if it doesn't lead to bad governance. If you could convince me, here's a shitty policy of Trump's, here's something Trump's doing really shitty, totally fair. I'm game for that. I've criticized Trump heavily just this week on many things, but I don't think that the character issue is anything that really interests me because it's just a means to an end.
Okay. Yeah, and all that's fair. I guess the point I'm trying to make is to counter the original take that you had and why it's not just something that it's not something that not necessarily should be hand waved, but it's not what I feel like people are making that argument out to be. Like you're saying that you should, like Democrats who like have like accepted or ignored or whatever the corruption that other administrations have had don't have like a right, or not necessarily don't have a right. They should be laughed at for criticizing Trump. My argument that I brought forth against that was that I think that it's valid for people to criticize Trump differently from the way they've criticized other administrations, given the fact that they believe that we could have like disagreements on how the country's run. I disagree that the country is run well as you do, but I feel like criticizing Trump based on his characteristics is important because those characteristics are the things that I see that are leading to those policies and the way that the country is run. So what I'm trying to do is make a case for the fact that when I say that his character is a reason why I criticize him more than other administrations, it's specifically because of the actions that he's taken that I feel are linked to that.
That's fine, but you understand from my perspective how that's sort of exactly what I'm criticizing with that statement that I made in Sarah Tomato's panel. Now, I know it's not your fault. I've done the same thing. You don't get to hear the whole first hour if you're coming in late. But one of the arguments I made, it's difficult to title a topic, right, in one sentence. My full argument was this. I have no problem with people criticizing Trump for specific actions he's taken if they criticize former administrations when those sorts of issues came up. For example, let's take something real simple. Mishandling of classified information. If you criticized Hillary and criticized Joe Biden, we're like, yeah, that's a big problem. You can't miss it. I have no problem at all. And I take it very seriously that you want to discuss the problems that Trump's had with that. Totally fine. But if your argument is, well, I didn't have a problem with Biden and Hillary doing that because they have a higher moral character, then I would politely tell you to fuck off, because I think that that's an excuse. And basically it comes down to what I always see Democrats do, which is to say, we're morally superior to you, so the standards that we want to enforce on you shouldn't apply to ourselves. And my answer to that is, that's why I ignore you. And I'm not saying you individual. I mean, that's why I ignore that type of argument, because there's no winning in that. At the end of the day, if it's just I mean, let's make it real simple. We were talking earlier about the N-word, right? If me and another white guy both use the N-word, like in the exact same joke, 5 minutes apart from each other, to the exact same audience, in the exact same location, right? And you're like, well, I think Rod's a good guy, so it's okay for him to use it, but that other guy, I think he's a piece of shit, so that was racist. At some point, you got to be like, unless you have some sort of context why you think that guy's saying it was racist, it seems to just be subjective. I know one guy, he seems good, so therefore he's allowed to do the same thing the other guy did, but it's bad when he does it. And I just reject taking that criticism seriously anymore, because I see this all over the place. I talk about this on my channel a lot. There was, when Dave Chappelle had this stand-up special on Netflix 3-4 years ago, he had a trans joke. And a lot of people that worked at Netflix were pissed off because they're trans advocates. So they decided to have this protest outside of their workstation, wherever the hell Netflix is stationed. And this comedian guy, I think his name was Vito, he showed up and he's holding a broomstick with a sign. And it says like, comedy's funny or something like that. The whole point he was making is, fucking Dave Chappelle's hilarious. He's telling jokes. He jokes about white people, black people, straight people, gay people, trans people. That's his whole spiel. He's fucking hilarious and offensive, right? Yep. What's up with the big old protest over this? And a bunch of these trans activists, they surround him and they rip his property from him. So this broomstick with a sign on it, and they rip the sign off the broomstick. And then they start shouting to the police, he's got a weapon. He's got a weapon. Now, it's making it look like he came with this weapon. And the comedian says, I think his name was Vito, he says, why are you doing this? And the crowd, one of the people in the crowd says, because you're awful. That's the problem I have. Those people have judged that if you're defending Dave Chappelle there, your character is flawed. And therefore, they're allowed to use physical violence against you because their character is superior. That's the exact same message I get when it's like, well, Rob, when I came in and said, look, just because former administrations did what we're bitching about Trump, we think Trump's character is poor. That's why we're justified criticizing Trump when we ignored these abuses when it happened in previous administration. Either those actions are worth of criticism, regardless if Trump did it, Biden did it, Hillary did it, Bill Clinton did it, Jimmy Carter did it, Ronald Reagan did it, or they're not worthy of criticism. I don't buy the character argument, meaning that we should ignore criticism of these actions for one people and hyper focus on it for another.
For sure. But I think that there's the key. That's the difference between the argument that you're talking about and the argument that I'm making. I'm not saying that because Trump's character is poor, we should ignore other administrations acting a certain way. In fact, I do think it's good to call out the way that the Democrats have acted before. We probably find a lot of agreement in certain details and certain things that they've done. I grew up as the kind of person where it was like, I've never really like trusted people in general. And I've always looked at things on a case by case basis and tried to understand the situation for what it was, as opposed to just playing team sports. So I fought a lot with people that are further to the left back when like the 2016 stuff, that whole era was happening. Like I had a stint where I was watching Ben Shapiro and everything, but my individual analysis of things led me still to being a Democrat because for one, it was a policy basis. I think that was for the most part about it. But in terms of ignoring the way that the Democrats acted in order and using the excuse that, oh, because Trump's character is bad, the Democrats don't get any critique. That's not a position I hold. The position I'm holding is that both of these people have acted in ways that I don't like, but one of them has certain character traits that can lead to worse outcomes in terms of the way that they act. So for instance, like if you had someone who, like, let's say I have a gun and you don't necessarily know me, but like people around me, like they'll trust me with the gun. They understand that I have this gun. I'm probably not going to shoot them. I don't have these certain character traits that would lead me to shoot them wildly. Someone else has a gun. You would probably trust them less if you knew that they were the kind of person to fly off at the handle with that gun. The situation is one thing, but the way that that person will utilize that situation is another. And I think it's important to look at the way that people act and understand that they could utilize this situation in a way that is in line with their character traits. And I just think Trump has enough of them for me to look at and be like, wow, yeah, Clinton did this same thing, but if he was in the position, he would do these things and do it in a worse way, given those traits.
But he hasn't. We would look at the outcomes to see if that's the case or not.
Yeah, that would be the meat of the conversation.
Right. So, like, again, so a couple things. One, if you're, again, you came in late to that conversation, but I was bringing up several issues throughout that debate that night. For example, mishandling of classified information or Russia collusion. Those were two things that I brought up. I had like 20 examples, but let's just stick with those two. That's simple. If your argument is, as mine was, I don't really give a shit about the idea of Russia collusion. I think it's slimy, but probably shouldn't be against the law to try to get dirt on your opponents from foreign actors. Now, if you're promising them shit, if you would say like, hey, if I win, then I'll give you shit, that's a totally different ballgame. But if you're just like, some Russian came up to me and I'm running for Congress and they're like, hey, your opponent, here's evidence they're having an affair. I mean, is that illegal? Is that something that's like highly, worth an FBI? I don't think so. But if you disagree and you say, yeah, I think that is a big deal, I'm fine with that perspective, as long as you apply it to both sides. So when we know that Hillary's team was working through intermediaries to talk to someone who at one point was a suspected Russian spy named Igor Dushenko, who actually did give them disinformation that was then actually used by the FBI to illegally spy on Trump's team. And if you only criticize Trump's side for trying to talk to a Russian to get dirt on his opponent, but you didn't have a problem or didn't want investigations on Hillary's side, then I have a huge problem. It seems to be that your answer is, no, I would criticize Hillary for that as much as I did Trump, either very heavily or I didn't criticize either side as much. That's fine. But then the response you give me of this, like, but it's about character, that seems totally irrelevant. Because, like, it seemed at first, even when I let you re-explain it there, you were like, well, what I'm saying is the reason we may have criticized Trump as opposed to Hillary is because of these character flaws. That's why your thesis that we should ignore Democrats that ignored these abuses when it happened under Democrat regimes, but now want to talk about them under Republicans, that's why I think you're incorrect. Because it didn't sound like the tone you had coming in there.
Hold on, can I clarify real quick?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I did this before and you just said it again. You keep seeming to say that it means that we shouldn't criticize the Democrats. You understand that's not my position, right?
Well, but should is irrelevant to did, right?
Even did.
Okay, would you say that it's fair for me to say this? Based on the tone of which you made this argument when you came onto a panel where I'm defending a statement that's basically like, if Democrats didn't criticize their regimes for this sort of stuff, then we should ignore them when they're criticizing Republicans. Could you understand why the impression that me and everyone else on the panel in the audience would get would be, you're making an excuse for why it was okay to not criticize those Democrats as much as Trump?
Yes. However, I don't believe the title of the show, and we've already explained this, I missed your first explanation of what you actually meant by the title, but I think the title didn't say anything specific about if they didn't criticize Democrats. It was something to the effect of Democrats that criticize Trump should just be laughed at. Like it was just that.
So then just to clarify, I'll make two statements, right? One, you would agree with me that if there was a Democrat that on a specific issue, such as mishandling of classified information, that didn't give a shit when Hillary or Biden did it, then I would be correct to say from my perspective, we shouldn't all of a sudden listen to them like they're taking it serious when Trump does it. You would agree with that statement?
I think anybody who has fealty to any kind of politician or just lets them slide for certain things, especially if they're the kind of person who doesn't look into the details to make sure that they're criticizing that thing accurately. Yeah, if you're that kind of person, then like I'm no Hillary Clinton fan either.
Okay.
I'm not a fan of a lot of people.
Okay, fair enough. And then the second point I would make is it also seemed, I don't want to screw this up, so I want to make sure I'm steelmanning here. It also seems as if when I said, but we could see, when you're like, well, because of his character, he may do worse. And I say, yeah, but we could see if he did or not, that we see the outcomes when it comes to the criticism. You seem to agree with that. You're like, you're right. We do see the outcomes. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, but I would disagree with the outcomes not lining up with those character traits. And I think that we would both disagree about the I guess the certain degrees of corruption that exists, or the certain incompetence or vindictiveness that's being carried out within this administration.
So then at the end of the day, the way we would evaluate this so that an impartial audience or an uninformed audience could try to make a decision on which of us is more correct, me that's going to be more defending Trump or you that's going to be more aggressively going after. In general, there might be areas that we would agree, but in general, that would be our posture. The way they would evaluate it is through our discussion of the outcomes. So, for example, on any given issue, if you say, actually, I think Trump's character would have made worse outcomes, then sort of I could say, okay, let's look at the mishandling of classified information. Let's look at actually what happened with Trump versus what happened with Hillary. And whoever wins that argument, if I win that what happened with Hillary was wrong, you may be right that you suspected, because you feel that Trump's character is more flawed than Hillary's, you suspected he would have been worse. But if I can prove he actually wasn't worse, then the character becomes a moot point on that particular issue.
Let me take over what you just said for 2 seconds, because I think you may have a very valid point, but I just want to respond accurately so I'm not mischaracterizing what you said. I believe that if we analyze the actual, we looked at both of these situations and looked at the distinctions, and you could prove like Hillary's to be worse than Trump's. I think that in that instance, character wouldn't matter as much in that situation.
That's why I'm saying, like, at the end of the day, why this conversation to me, or the topic when you're talking about Trump's character or personality, why I was hand waving it. Now, two things real quick. I still hand wave it because I think you could see why I don't really care about character. I care about the outcomes. But obviously, and I think you understand this, in a panel atmosphere where it's like 9 people versus me, I'm going to be a little shorter. It's going to be a little more contentious. I don't mean anything by it. I'm not personally attacking you, but that's
Nah, I know what it is, bro. It's all good.
So that's why, like, when you bring it up in the context of that, to me, it sounds like you're saying, well, no, we were okay not criticizing Hillary or not criticizing Biden and now criticizing Trump. And now you're clarifying, I get it. But you understand that's why I was so short with this argument before, because the way it sounded to me, like you were basically saying, hey, well, Trump's a shithead. And so we're going to evaluate him differently because he's a shithead. And to me, that's this absolutely moving target that it's going to be it gets to sort of speak to Trump's intent. You know, like a famous situation, for me famous at least, was quid pro quo. Trump was impeached for an alleged quid pro quo on a phone call with Zelensky because he said, hey, what's up with firing this prosecutor that was looking into Joe Biden's son's company? And all of the Democrats say, we know what was in Trump's heart when he said that. He did that to steal an election. He did that to get dirt in his opponent. And then when you're like, okay, well, what about Joe Biden's quid pro quo, where he actually did a quid pro quo, where he forced the firing of a prosecutor that was looking at his son's business, and they have the exact opposite tack. There's no way that he would do that for personal benefit. That's absurd. Once you claim to be able to read the mind and understand the character, etc., then it becomes impossible to like sort of, I'm not going to convince you. You're not going to convince me. Everyone's going to have their predetermined bias. And they're going to say, you know, yeah, I think Trump's a bad man, or I think Trump's a good man. And so that's, you know, for the purposes of this conversation, yeah, I'm willing to listen to you talk about Trump's character flaws. That's fine. My argument's going to be, I think that's pretty much true of almost every national level politician. And even to the extent it's not, I don't know how to evaluate it other than looking at the outcomes. Let me ask you this. Do you agree with the assessment? I hear this from a lot of Democrats, and it's probably true, that Jimmy Carter seems like the nicest dude that's been president for a long, long time. Would you agree with that?
To be honest, I would not be able to tell you. I'm not like super young, but like I haven't really dug into Jimmy Carter.
Dude, I'm no student of history myself. So, but the word on Jimmy Carter is he's this really sweet old, like now he's a sweet, well, he's passed away, but he's a sweet old man married to the same lady for like years and years and was like, seemed like a likable, nice guy. But a lot of people consider him one of the worst modern presidents. He sort of was a pushover. And so you could say, well, his character had a lot of things that you'd want in a neighbor. Like he seems trustworthy. He seems like a nice guy. You know, you probably don't want Trump as a neighbor. He'd be like fucking trying to redraw property lines every 5 minutes or some shit, you know, yelling at you because you didn't mow your grass or some shit, you know. But sometimes those characteristics that we sometimes consider flawed in some aspects can end up being beneficial. I'm not suggesting that if you're like, you know, a liar, that's good, but you see what I'm saying. So
yeah, no, I completely understand exactly what you're saying. And there is a case for, you know, some aspects of Trump being certain characteristics that he has being beneficial in certain cases. Like for instance, in his first term, I remember when he had stepped into North Korea for the first time. And I was the kind of person where, yeah, I voted against Trump, but in his first time, I was like, hey, he's the president. Like, that's it. Let's just give him a chance. There were certain things that he did. I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's cool. Like, let's see where that goes. However, there was enough aspects of his character that led to certain things that he had done that made it seem like, yeah, this isn't the leader that we want, because these aspects of him don't feel like, not only do they not feel like a leader, they lead into these actions that I see, and we could talk about that sort of stem from that.
So that's fine. I would say that I think Trump's first term was the best term, with the exception of maybe the last 9 months with the pandemic. Though my criticisms of Trump and that's going to probably be the opposite of yours. I thought he was too strict.
Well, that's interesting. Real quick, do you think would you rate the first term? I know the second term isn't like necessarily done from what you've seen so far. You would rate the second term over the first term?
I don't know. It's too early. There's things that you like. I mean, if we end up directly attacking Iran, I would say probably not. That's going to piss me off mightily.
I've seen the contention with that in the backtracking on the immigration.
Yeah. Stuff. Right. Now, he seemed to backtrack on the backtrack about the immigration shit. One of the things that I think actually makes Trump an interesting president, when it comes to an idea of character, is he's not an ideologue. I would prefer, to me, the ideal president would be someone who shares my ideological leanings immensely so. And so that he wouldn't just change when the winds change. I want someone who's pro-choice, or I want someone who's pro-Second Amendment. And even if it becomes unpopular, will still govern being pro-Second Amendment. Trump's sort of not like that. Trump's a dude that wants to be liked. Trump's a dude that sort of is willing, because he's not ideological. He views himself as a deal maker. So if he feels that his base is changing on him, he'll be like, yeah, whatever. I don't really give a shit. I don't feel strongly about any of this shit. On one hand, that's bad, because that means that, like, you got a guy in there who's sort of a wild card who may change his mind. But on the other hand, it's good. They used to say that this was sort of like governing like a delegate. In other words, whatever your constituents think is how you'll vote. You know, and there's a lot of good that could come from that. If all of your constituents say, actually, we disagree with you on this policy, and he says, oh, okay, then I'll change my mind. There's something to be said of that. Again, to each their own, but there are people that have been elected in Congress and even at your local level. I mean, I know a guy on the local school board here who, like, staunchly has opinions and never votes based on what his opinions are. Instead, he almost exclusively sends out flyers and questionnaires to his constituents and says, how do you want me to vote on this? And if more people say vote this way than that way, it doesn't matter what he personally thinks. He says, I'm just trying to represent the people. Now, that's not an ideologue. That's some, you know, now you could say, well, Trump gets there through a place of fucking arrogance and narcissism. Maybe. But the outcome's what matters to me. And so, you know, I'll take the guy that's a narcissist that's willing to listen to his constituents over the person who seems really nice and is an ideologue that's like a communist and driving us down the road to, you know, hell. That's the way I look at it.
It seems that you just there recognize that there's a specific character trait in him that leads him to act a certain way. And you did highlight a positive like way that can be looked at, where they're sort of like seeing their constituents move one way and they're moving that way. I would argue that even though that can be good in some ways, there's certain areas of policy where that's probably not a good thing. And that is one of those things that I would say is important to actually look at the character trait to understand how he would act that way. Like with the economy, I know that you were someone who said that like a stable business environment or like investor stability is a very good thing. Would you agree with the fact that that impulsivity as a character trait and using that within that realm of policy doesn't feed into or doesn't allow for that stability?
Yeah, I think definitely. It makes it less. In fact, instead of the word stability, see if you like this word better, because I think it's more apt to what we're talking about. Predictability, right? What businesses want is predictability. Right. Most businesses would rather be taxed a little more, but understand that that system's not going to change, than get taxed less, but worry that it could change at a moment's notice. So clearly someone who is, and I'm going to use a word here, right? I'm going to use it intentionally. I think you'll see why.
N-word, huh?
There it is. A person who is, quote, more democratic would necessitate less predictability because the will of the people can change quite frequently. However, there are clearly good things that come with democracy and being more democratic. For example, one negative could be if we have only ideologues that are put in place that are unwilling to listen to their constituents, and if those ideologues see their chance to get elected by adhering to only a certain small specific group, let's just say donors, wealthy donors, then the chance of the will of the people actually being heard and implemented is very low. Whereas if you have someone, although it is a less predictable environment, that is willing to change their mind based on the will of the people, then the chances of the will of the people actually being implemented is higher. So you take the good with the bad. Ultimately, you don't want too much of either characteristic, and I wouldn't argue that Trump's too democratic or too much on a whim. There's very little that he's blatantly changed his mind about in a significant way, at least not more so than modern presidents. For example, I mean, up until seemingly the other day, even presidents like Barack Obama and Joe Biden were vehemently against gay marriage. They've done a 180. Joe Biden used to be against the Hyde Amendment on abortions. And seemingly, I think he claimed he talked to Alyssa Milano one night on the phone and changed his mind. I mean, those are stark changes as well. So to answer your question, yes, most characteristics, I mean, clearly there are characteristics that we would say are almost always a net negative, like, you know, chronic narcissism. Although there can be some benefits that come with that, we would probably say that that's a net negative.
Yeah, which is what I tried to get at in the beginning when I talked about there's some traits that are probably like intersubjectively we can agree that those are negative. Right?
It's you might be surprised though, right? Any trait though could be taken to a toxic level. Not to sound like a fucking feminist here, but like toxic masculinity. But the problem
is,
bro,
rob the feminists.
There we go. Yeah, like with the idea of toxic masculinity, what they'll do is they'll take traits that are masculine traits and then take them to an absurd level and say, see how bad that is. But the truth is, almost every trait could be a positive. For example, like aggressiveness. You could say that could be toxic masculine. Sure, if you're an aggressive asshole who's waiting in line at McDonald's and you're beating the shit out of people in front of you, yeah. But if you're aggressive in protecting your family, aggressive in sort of bettering yourself, working out, advancing your career to help your family, etc., those are good traits. Right. And so every trait can have positive and negative connotations. If you take them too far to the extreme, there's not even traits that you would say like, no, how could this be negative? Like caring, like being a very caring person. Can you be too caring to where that becomes a negative trait? Absolutely, you can be. Mm-hmm. So it becomes difficult then when we talk about the characteristics of someone like Trump and we're like, well, these are characteristics that we don't want to see in a president. Yeah, hypothetically, that's true. You could say that about almost any characteristic. I could build, like, if we're playing some role-playing game, I could build the character, you know, with traits and shit that I think would make the best president. That's not going to exist in the real world because there's all kinds of crazy shit. Like, the same characteristics you need to get on top of the business world and that you need to get on top of the political world probably makes you an asshole to most people. And so it's like, yeah, it would be nice if I mean, shit, Devon, wouldn't you say this? Have you ever noticed how many people get really huge in the streaming world that seem to be huge assholes? Is it that they're assholes and that's what leads them to be good streamers? Or is it once you get to be a popular streamer, you become an asshole? I don't know. I've asked myself.
Actually, what I would say probably is that people who are assholes probably have more, not necessarily charisma, but there's some sort of character to them. There's some sort of bite. As where, you know, people who aren't assholes, you can either have charisma or you could have no charisma. But if you're an asshole, you're more likely to have that sort of like bite, something interesting about you. So therefore you kind of filter your way into the top.
Totally agree. Yeah. I think politics in the business world's like that as well. The people you know that are like, I've always been pretty loose with my money, right? Like in the sense that I'll help people out or I don't talk about it. I think it defeats the point of charity to talk about how charitable you are. But in general, I guess we won't use me. We'll use a random person. The type of person that's like, oh, I don't really give a shit about getting rich. I have enough to pay my bills. I'll help out my neighbors. I'll help out my family. That person's probably never going to be worth as much as Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the type of guy that could walk into Twitter and be like, yeah, 90% of you are fucking fired. I would be mortified to do that. If I somehow got to own a big company, I would be the worst boss in the world because I'd be like, oh, you have a family. I don't want to fire you. But then that company would run poorly because I would keep on a bunch of people that weren't doing their job well because I'd feel bad for their circumstance. And so on one hand, you would say, well, Elon looks like a total asshole, the type of guy that could just callously fire a person like that. Maybe you're right. But that's how he got to the position where he could own a company like that. Because those
same but I don't necessarily know if his approach to government has like proved to be the best way to do that. It seems like those characteristics only work in certain areas, and you can't carry that over certainly. That might
be true, but then a lot of the negative characteristics you're going to talk about Trump, like something like narcissism or a desire to obtain power. That's going to be true of 90% of our elected politicians.
Those are universal, yeah. Right. Which is why when I considered all of his characteristics, I didn't necessarily lean into thinking those because the reality is, again, like the goal of politics is to gain power. I think that there are degrees to wanting power, to where someone could want to maintain power, as opposed to they get power, they've had the power, and all right, we've done the thing, and I had it, and it's whatever. I do think that there's room for extremes in there, but yeah, desire for power is generally just a political thing. So I didn't really think of that. I more so thought about things that were, I guess, the best way to describe this is I thought of things that were universal, but I thought of things that were either uniquely extreme to him in ways that bled into the actions that he did. Like, for instance, vindictiveness. I think that the I don't know if you know anything about the memos that he's put out, but do you see that he's literally put out memos that are like directing sanctions against lawyers who just were like, they didn't like him or they ruled against him when they were working with someone else? Do you think that that's sort of like a comically vindictive action to take?
I think that he's doing the precedent that was set against him and he's pissed off. I think vindictiveness is correct. I think that he certainly feels like he was targeted unjustly, as were many of his allies, including attorneys. And he says, okay, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. The difference is Trump would not be a good criminal, because Trump's the sort of dude that's going to wear it in his sleeve. Yeah, man, I'm going to rob that bank. Right now, that criminal sucks, and fuck that guy, lock him up. Right. But the guy that comes to you with the suit and tie goes, oh my God, robbing a bank, that's absurd, and then robs it. In many ways, that person's worse because you were belied. You didn't know their true intentions. So the way the law is set up, sometimes Trump digs his own hole, because he'll come out and he'll say something. It's like, dude, every other politician does that shit. It's just they keep it under their vest. Not Trump. He'll just be like, fuck these guys. They came at me. I'm going to go at them. But the precedent, unfortunately, and this is sort of the argument I was making on that panel, look, I warned people. I said, here's what's going to happen. Once you set the precedent for these little petty shit that you're going after Trump and you're getting his lawyers disbarred and all this shit, that shit will bite you in the ass. Once that becomes the norm, once side A says we're totally morally justified, we can do this to our opponent, when side B gets power, they're going to say, okay, them's the rules. Now we're going to do it to you. And so when side A starts going, oh my God, this is so vindictive, my response to that is, go fuck yourself. That's the world you wanted. People like me told you not to do it, and you didn't give a shit. I'm not saying you. I'm saying, the Democrats.
No, I get it. You is the general word. Yeah.
I sat here for years talking about the lawfare against Trump, the comical impeachments against Trump, the comical leaks against Trump, the FBI illegally spying against Trump. And I said, you are aware that inevitably, whether it be Trump or some Trumpian type figure, they're going to get in power. Again, it might be 4 years, it might be 20 years, it might be 60 years. But when they do, this shit's coming back on you. It's coming. For sure. And that's what's happened. Yeah. Trump's just more transparent about it.
My question would be that, do you think that it's fair to carry out, or I don't even know how you would say this, get vindication or carry out vindication, or just be vindictive toward individuals who weren't part of that group of people that did something to you in the first place?
Who's Trump targeting that wasn't part of that group?
I'm sure you know about the Chris Krebs thing, right? Can you tell me what Chris Krebs did to Trump in order to
I don't know exactly what
an investigation into him?
No, I don't know exactly what Chris Krebs' rule was previously. I also don't know exactly what Trump's memo said about Chris Krebs. I do know this. I was told in debate after debate after debate after debate I did that was excusing the Obama administration starting, and then people at the top of the FBI that hated Trump continuing the investigations into Trump. I was told by the IG and others that the threshold for opening investigations are brutally low. Brutally low. Okay. That's
is that a like a legal fact?
Yes. To open an FBI investigation, according to the IG and according to the FBI's policies, to open an investigation, the threshold is remarkably low. Okay.
Can you give me an example of someone, a previous administration specifically doing that? And I just want to give you context, because it seems like you don't know about the Chris Krebs thing as much. You haven't dug into it. But the memorandum into him is basically for falsely and baselessly denying the election was stolen.
Okay.
Do you think that it's a good use of, I guess, the trait of vindictiveness to carry this out against someone who just denied that the 2020 election was stolen?
I think that it would depend on what he did. What was Chris Krebs' role?
Chris Krebs' role, I forget. He was he ran something. He ran a specific thing, some sort of like a program. I'll have to look it up, but basically what he did was, and this is what's outlined in the memorandum. You can pull it up if you have the time, or I can pull it up, but he basically just denied that the election was stolen. And they had also said, Trump had said that he suppressed conservative talking points, collusion with big tech, and a potential dissemination of confidential information. And this was just based on the election. Like,
okay, so I'm just reading here. Here's what I'm reading.
Mm-hmm.
Chris Krebs was the head of SISA. SISA, one of the most corrupt organizations that was working with social media to censor conservatives. So that's who SISA is. He was the director of SISA. He should absolutely be fired and be investigated for crimes. We'll see exactly what Trump suggests here, though. He was fired in November 2020. He was fired in a memo, or the memo you're talking about was April 9th, 2025. Addressing risk from Chris Krebs and government censorship. He absolutely did. The SISA was involved in government censorship. It directed federal agencies to immediately revoke any active security clearance held by Krebs. That's good. It should be. He advocated for censorship of people like me and people that, or at least that agency did. It also ordered suspension of clearances for individuals associated with him, including SentinelOne, where he was chief intelligence and public officer. The memo instructed Attorney General, the DNI, and others to investigate Krebs' activities during his tenure at SISA, focusing on allegations of censorship and misconduct related to the 2020 election and COVID-19. It called for a comprehensive evaluation of SISA's activity over the past 6 years. The memo accused him of being a bad faith actor who weaponized and abused his authority by suppressing conservative viewpoints under the guise of combating disinformation, coercing social media platforms to censor speech related to the 2020 election and COVID-19, denying claims that the 2020 election was rigged and stolen, dismissing alleged election malfeasance and voting. I believe Krebs was the guy that said it was the most secure election ever, which that's a statement so outlandish that it would probably strongly suggest that he would have been willing to cover up any allegations of being rigged, and suppressing information about Hunter Biden's.
A lot of people said that statement.
Okay, I'll ask you, do you think the 2020 election was the most secure ever?
I don't know, to be honest. It could have been, it could have not been. There's a lot of discrepancies that did happen. I think that when people sort of say political messaging, they go a little too far and they like exaggerate, but right. You can probably find elections that are a little more secure. You can probably not.
Well, a little more. I mean, just on this basis alone, because of the pandemic, we had states like my state of Pennsylvania that massively changed the way they voted from in-person voted to having mail-in ballots. And we could see that mail-in ballots, almost in every country in Europe, they acknowledge that they're less secure, not just through fraud, which certainly is a fear, but also through things like mistakes. You're more likely to make a mistake. There's all sorts of mistakes that could happen if you're filling out your ballot by mail. You can put the wrong date, the wrong address, all sorts of shit that could disqualify the ballot. So the idea that we would say that it is the most secure election ever when we massively change the way we vote is outlandish on its face.
Sure, but regardless of that, do you think that, because you had made a statement that him saying that means he's more likely to cover something up? Yes, why do you think him saying that makes him likely?
Okay, let me rephrase. Fair enough. It shows that he has a brutal bias. And I could intuit from that bias that bias could be so much as that he would potentially cover things up. Are you aware of the story that's breaking like today? That it turns out that the FBI knew that there were allegations that China was trying to get false IDs to send to people in order to sway the election for Joe Biden. And that the FBI sent a memo to other agencies, I bet SISA was one of them, asking them to destroy that evidence that story was coming about. Then Chris Wray directly testified in front of Congress that there was no evidence that there were any plots to affect the 2020 election. If
you had said that broke today, I definitely didn't hear about it.
I think it broke 2 days ago, but there's more of it that's coming up every day. But let's say that's hypothetically true. Let's say that we would find out, actually there was some sort of concerted efforts. Hell, what if it's just the same as Russia's efforts in 2016? What if a bunch of Chinese nationals placed $100,000 of ads on Pokemon Go and Facebook, and evidence suggested it's because China wanted Hillary Clinton to win? Do you think then Chris Krebs and Chris Wray saying most secure election ever, there's no evidence that anyone was trying to interfere with the election, would that be warrant? Like, wait a minute, why would you say that if you knew that wasn't the case?
If they knew that was the case and they said that, then obviously they'd be lying. And obviously, like, if that becomes the case, if that's the case, I have no problem calling them out. However, I do want to dig more into the Chris Krebs thing, because you said he was the director of SISA. So what did SISA do specifically that you felt was corrupt that warrants Chris Krebs' investigation?
SISA was the point group that was working with social media, the Twitter file showed, in order to censor conversations about things such as the origins of the pandemic, the results of the 2020 election, other things like that, the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop. SISA was sort of this agency that was publicly promoting censoring disinformation. And the way that they censored disinformation, they weren't censoring disinformation about Trump, like the Russia security, the Russia collusion bullshit and a bunch of rumors about Trump. It ended up them censoring stories that would benefit Trump. So Hunter Biden laptop, origins of the pandemic, possible malfeasance in the 2020 election. That's what SISA was doing.
Okay. Was SISA doing this during Trump's administration as well?
Yes. So there's evidence that particularly when it came to questions, it obviously ramped up and there was direct movement from the Biden administration directly reaching out to social media companies to censor things, particularly about the pandemic and the 2020 election. But certainly SISA was interested in starting these disinformation councils and was instrumental in pushing that sort of mentality. I believe SISA, I could be wrong, don't quote me on this, but there was a convention at the Aspen Institute where a bunch of social media people and journalists showed up. And I think SISA was the group that was holding that convention where they said, hey, hypothetically, there'll be a big story that breaks before the election. And let's just say, I don't know, hypothetically, some member of Joe Biden's family, maybe hypothetically, this story will say worked for some corrupt, pro-Russian company or something and got a bunch of money from it. Yeah, that would be like an example of Russian disinformation. Okay. I mean, they primed social media to censor a story, which, by the way, polling suggested that as high as 1/3 of Democrats said had they believed that the Hunter Biden laptop story was accurate instead of falsely believing that it was Russian disinformation, they would have considered not voting for Biden or voting for Trump. So that's certainly a story that had huge impact on the election.
I mean, I've seen that poll, but to be honest, I mean, I'm not going to be one of those, polls don't, mean anything. Because, there are some polls that cite everything, but that specific cited, there's a lot of people who say they would vote a certain way.
Sure.
But I do understand.
But the point I'm trying to make is, regardless if it would have swung the election or not, clearly there was a concerted effort by members of our intelligence community and former members of the intelligence community to protect Joe Biden and to censor that story. You agree with that?
Okay. I'm
asking you
and
if
the
you
reason
agree.
why. Yeah, my answer was I'm not certain. And the reason why I'm not certain with that is because when I do look into the Hunter Biden thing and them actually signing that letter, it seemed that there was reason to believe that the copy of the laptop wasn't holding accurate information. I don't even think the letter said specifically that the laptop itself was fake. I think it was about the information that was on it, which is valid because of the ties that they had pointed to with Rudy Giuliani and the Russian people.
Okay, so you acknowledge that the FBI knew that the laptop was accurate.
I acknowledge that they knew that the laptop existed.
Okay. So then what we would have to believe your position is, in one of the biggest coincidences of all time, people at the head of the FBI that Chuck Schumer warned us would find 6 ways of Sunday getting back at Trump, that people like Peter Strzok talked about having an insurance policy to prevent Trump from winning, that people like James Comey have since came out and I think it's beyond dispute that they hated Trump. And this is 2020, so it's after the 2016 election. What you would have me believe is no one at those agencies with security clearances, or more accurately, former people with those agencies with security clearance, not one of them called out, hey, this information about Trump seems like Russian disinformation with the whole Russia collusion shit. Not one person did it. Not one person went publicly and said, this sounds like Russian disinformation. And it turned out they were wrong. That actually was disinformation
Hold on,
sourced
hold on.
by.
I'm trying to figure out what you just asked me. You're saying not what, like, I think it's.
Let me break it down to you.
Yeah.
There was Russian disinformation that was a lie about Trump. That was the Igor Dashchenko's claims in the Christopher Steele dossier. The FBI bought it hook, line, and sinker and used it to spy on Trump's team illegally. No one said anything. But then there was accurate information in the form of the Hunter Biden laptop. And all of a sudden, the same people that were silent when there actually was Russian disinformation, somehow they didn't see it. They were duped again. This time they said, oh, this looks like Russian disinformation. And so the same guy that they wanted to win, it just so happened they were duped. They came out in support and said, this looks like Russian disinformation. Whoops, they were wrong again. Why did not one of those people speak up when there actually was Russian disinformation?
Okay, so that's another thing that I would just have to dig into, full transparency in terms of them speaking up, because I've done a lot of research on the actual Steele dossier and what, like, who should and should not be accountable and all that stuff, and why they decided to go with that information and who knew that it was going to be in a dossier. In terms of the FBI knowing that this was false at a certain time, that's definitely something I have to dig into to actually give you an honest answer on that.
Well, okay, let's be clear. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah, rephrase, because maybe I'm misunderstanding.
I'm not saying that they knew it was false when it was illegal. They did know these allegations were false, but I can't prove that, right? So what we do know is they were deemed illegal because there was information withheld from the FISA court. That's the problem. Now, the FBI might say, well, we truly believe that the allegations were true, and so that's why we were investigating, or we weren't sure if they were true. That's why we were investigating. But the reason they were illegal wasn't because it was proven that they knew it was a lie and they kept investigating. It's because they changed evidence in the case of Kevin Kleinsmith, or they withheld evidence from the FISA court. For example, they withheld the fact that they met with the primary subsource, Igor Dashchenko, and Igor Dashchenko told them, basically, this was all bar talk. I don't have proof for any of these. And they didn't tell the FISA court that. They just said, we met with Igor Dashchenko. I'm talking about the FBI that was doing the investigation, Comey's team.
Yeah, I understand
that. The FBI.
I understand that. But when you say they, we're talking about like a whole, like, I'm trying to actually figure out the individuals who are responsible for these things. So when you say they, you're speaking of the entire FBI.
Kevin Kleinsmith, Andrew McCabe, Kevin Kleinsmith, pretty much the 8-person team that was investigating Trump with the Russia collusion, almost all of which were the same ones that were investigating Hillary. They went as easy as possible against Hillary and hard as possible against Trump. Right?
Okay, well, my question is, Kevin Kleinsmith was held accountable, correct?
Yeah, what was his punishment?
It fell within the guidelines of the 0 to 6
He got a small fine and lost his license to practice law for a year.
Yeah, didn't what's his name, Carter Page, actually ask for them to like go easy on Kleinsmith anyway?
He may have. It's irrelevant.
Hold on, no, I think that is relevant, because isn't that what a judge considers when they actually decide to punish him?
The judge, who, by the way, I believe is Judge Boasberg, the same guy that's rolling against Trump, who happens to get all these cases now and rolls against Trump every time. That same guy, I don't care what Carter Page said. Carter Page wasn't the only victim. Did they ask Trump if he thought? Wasn't he a victim of this smear as well? Did they ask all the people whose data was collected by these FISA warrants how harsh the penalty should have been?
Maybe not. If me and
you are roommates and someone breaks in and steals our shit, and you say, I don't think that this guy should be punished that hard, why wouldn't they ask me? My shit got stolen too.
That's fair, and I would have to see the other people who were like.
And furthermore, what's it matter that Kleinsmith received some sort of slap on the wrist punishment? What's the relevance of this whatsoever? The reason we're on this particular topic was you're like, well, the reason that it's not a big deal that SISA primed social media to think that this Hunter Biden laptop story was.
I have to clarify. I did not say it was not a big deal.
Okay, it seemed that you implied that it wasn't by saying, well, actually, they had reason to believe that it was Russian disinformation at the time.
No, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a big deal. That just means that it seems that the facts lead to the conclusion making more sense than something that is a little more like nefarious.
What didn't?
And I'm not here to say that it is or isn't. But when I look into the facts of the situation, and if we're talking specifically about the Kleinsmith situation, I can understand from afar thinking that, oh wow, like he should have been like way punished before that. And even I could disagree outside of like the legal case. I could disagree morally, and I could be like, yeah, he probably shouldn't have, like, he probably should have gotten more time. However, when I look at the guidelines, I look at the fact that the first offense, it was his first offense, and it was considered.
It's irrelevant.
When
it's
I look
irrelevant.
at the fact that
I
know you say it's irrelevant, and
it's
maybe
irrelevant
we would agree outside of the law that it's irrelevant morally. But I'm literally just going by.
I want you to explain to me in the audience right now why Kevin Kleinsmith has anything whatsoever to do with the point you're making about Hunter Biden laptop. Go ahead.
Okay. My explanation is that we kind of went down a rabbit hole, and I was gonna try earlier to bring it back to the Chris Krebs thing, because that's kind of what we were trailing down, but I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, the point is, when I said, I was making one point. We have all these people at these intel agents and former intel agencies. On one hand, there was actual Russian disinformation. None of them spoke out and said, this looks like Russian disinformation. That happened to harm Trump. On the other hand, we had what wasn't Russian disinformation, and all of these people came out and said, yes, this looks like Russian disinformation. And that also happened to harm Trump. And you're like, yeah, but Kevin Kleinsmith got punished.
No,
you
that
see
was just,
why I'm saying that?
No. Hold on. You gotta understand what I'm saying. You brought up Kevin Kleinsmith, and I just responded to the Kevin Kleinsmith thing. That has nothing to do with everything we were talking about before. That was a direct response to something you brought up. If we want to talk about the differences between these cases, we can do that. But I was honing in on one specific thing that
me bringing up Kevin Kleinsmith was in this context, that the FBI illegally spied on Trump's team. You seem to think, or you implied that that was because they knew that the information was inaccurate. I said, well, no. The reason that it was deemed illegal was because they changed evidence, at least one person, Kevin Kleinsmith, and they withheld evidence, right?
Yeah, like
the idea of whether or not Kevin Kleinsmith was punished is irrelevant to the point I was making. The reason that these FISA warrants were deemed illegal was because of that. The punishment that Kevin Kleinsmith got, which once you said he was punished, I'm forced to inform the audience, he was given a slap on the wrist, to which you're then like, yeah, but that slap on the wrist was justified. I disagree with that, but it's a red herring that has nothing to do.
No. I did not say it was justified. I said even morally, I could disagree with it. So let me tell you what I feel. I feel in that situation, without like a full understanding of the law, aside from what I brought in, I feel like that's highly irresponsible, and that's crazy that someone could get away with that. However, I'm not someone who's in the profession of law. So when I actually look at, is this normal for somebody to be punished this way for this thing? And I looked at all the things that were considered. I'm like, yeah, unfortunately, the law disagrees with what I feel. That's
I don't care. I'm saying that the punishment level of him is irrelevant to the grander scheme of things.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just contesting the fact that you said it was justified.
Let's try a different tact. You said that these intel officials, that there was definitely a lot of evidence that suggested this could have been Russian disinformation. Give me some of that evidence. What were they looking at that made them suspect this would have been it?
I believe it pointed to like Rudy Giuliani's ties to like Russian people, and the fact that he had a copy of the laptop, which I guess makes sense.
Okay, so the argument is because Rudy Giuliani is on Trump's team. Right?
No, that's not what I said. That's not what I said. Could you repeat what I said? So your
because Rudy Giuliani had the laptop. Okay, so then what?
Because he had no. Because he had a copy of the laptop and he had ties to Russian oligarchs.
Okay, so then instead of using the word Rudy Giuliani, because you're saying his connections to Trump are irrelevant. Right, because when I brought that up, you said, no, that's not what I'm saying.
No. You asked me what was the evidence that they believed it was Russian disinformation.
Right, and I started the fact I implied because you said Rudy Giuliani that. Okay, I made the mistake of thinking that you would make the argument because Rudy Giuliani was Trump's lawyer and he had connections to Russians. Please let me finish. Please let me. Okay, so then a human being that had connections to Russia had the laptop. That's why they thought, oh, that's it, right? The name Rudy Giuliani is irrelevant.
Someone who had a copy to the laptop that had ties to Russian oligarchs. Yeah.
Okay, so
but that's only one point of evidence, just for the record.
Okay, so on that point, so then you would say anyone that had connections to Russia that had incriminating evidence against another politician, we should be skeptical of that evidence, that it has the hallmarks of Russian disinformation?
I think if they had ties to something and they had like a copy of that somebody's property, then that would probably warrant it a little more.
What does the copy of the property? What does the copy of the property have anything to do with it?
Because if the person who has the copy of the property has ties to these oligarchs, then
What does,
especially if it's, hold on, I'm just answering the question. Especially if it's something that they can alter the information on, like say a copy of a laptop, then that's sort of reason to believe that, yeah, what gets released might be altered because you can do that.
okay, so if it wasn't that, if he didn't have the laptop and instead some dirty ass Russian had the laptop and Rudy Giuliani had connections to the Russian and Rudy Giuliani fed the information and said, oh, here's what these emails will say. I can't show them to you, but trust me, Russians have it that this happened. You would say that's totally on board then, that the FBI would never say that has connections to Russian disinformation.
You got to repeat that one more time.
Right. If Rudy Giuliani didn't have the laptop and instead said, I met with a Russian who showed me this. I personally don't have the laptop, but the Russians showed me these emails, right? And they said that they have these emails that Hunter Biden did, all the stuff that the laptop accused. Then you're saying the FBI would have never suspected that this was Russian disinformation because Rudy himself didn't have the laptop. My question to you is, why does having physical possession of the laptop matter?
I got to answer the first question though. Because I have questions for myself about that, because I'm curious actually. Would the pathway to do that be becoming like a whistleblower in order to like say that, oh, I got this information from, I'm asking you because you seem to know more about that.
Let's say no. Let's say that he used that information for political purposes and also took it to the FBI. You could use the term whistleblower if you want. I think whistleblower means someone who works within an agency that then speaks out about
I was asking
within that agency. So I would not say that Rudy Giuliani.
I was asking a legitimate question of, if someone were to do that, would that be the proper process? That was my question.
Well, no, because I guess my answer is, to be a whistleblower, it's very specific. You have to work within an agency. So in no way whatsoever would Rudy Giuliani be a whistleblower in that context.
Okay, yeah. If he was doing that outside of like applying to that, then maybe it would be a little shady.
Wait. If he was doing it outside of
I guess like being a whistleblower, and it was just something like that.
Define to me, how would Rudy Giuliani be a whistleblower? Whistleblowing against what?
Trump wasn't the president at that time, right?
Well, Trump was president when allegedly Rudy Giuliani got this laptop.
Okay, yeah, wouldn't it be whistleblowing against the government at that time?
How?
I'm genuinely asking.
He's not a member of government. He wouldn't be protected by whistleblower laws or anything of the nature. Whistleblowers are, you work for a government agency. You see something that's corrupt. You go to your bosses. They don't deal with it. You go outside of that. There are specific laws that protect you then going outside of your agency to blow the whistle on the corruption you see within. A person who is not working for government that says, I see, for example, if I see Trump tomorrow, like taking money from, Xi from China, I wouldn't be a whistleblower because I'm not working for Trump. I would say, I saw something corrupt. I would report it. You're not a whistleblower if you see someone break into your neighbor's house and you report the crime.
Yeah,
right?
This is literally why I was asking you, because I genuinely didn't know. Like, that was a genuine question. I wasn't debating you.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. So then Rudy's not a whistleblower. He talks to this Russian. Russian says, we got Hunter Biden's laptop. It shows all this shit. He takes that shit to Trump. Trump uses it in the campaign trail, and they go to the FBI and say, we saw this. Is that would the FBI in that world say, oh, this doesn't have the hallmarks of Russian disinformation because Rudy doesn't have physical possession of the laptop?
I don't know, because that scenario hasn't played out, so I wouldn't know if they would. From what I know, that the situation that actually did occur, him having that image of the laptop was one of the things that they considered.
What about that situation that I just outlined would make you think that there's a possibility that people at the FBI or former intel officials would not think that was Russian disinformation?
Literally the fact that it seems that there's a lot of discretion when it comes to these things, and I don't necessarily have the information to know how they would react in a situation that happened.
That's exactly my point. Exactly my point. These people that didn't like Trump used their discretion to say that they thought the thing that wasn't Russian disinformation was, and the thing that was Russian disinformation wasn't. And both times it was to go after Trump, who they don't like. And you're right. Individuals can have discretion on what they say. Now, the claims within the laptop, other than, and the reason I bring up that hypothetical is because I hate to break this to you, but did you know there was this guy named Igor Dushenko that was investigated for potentially being a Russian spy that was working through intermediaries to help Hillary Clinton's team, who actually did spread Russian disinformation that not only did Hillary Clinton's team use, but they actually fed to the FBI, who didn't verify and then used it to illegally spy on Trump. And yet not one former intel official spoke up and said, this has the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. Even when they knew the primary subsource was a Russian person who had connection to Russian intelligence. And yet not one of them said it. And just because, though, Rudy Giuliani's the person with the laptop, they're like, this looks like Russian disinformation to us. And despite the fact that you're downplaying this, it makes it even worse.
You're throwing a lot at me, man. I got to answer.
Okay, I'll pause. Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So when you talk about the Igor Dushenko thing, so this is my understanding, and you can tell me where I'm wrong about this. So I understood that this information, a lot of the people that had given this information, they weren't aware that it was going into a dossier. Hillary ended up paying for this information from like some law firm she was working for, and it was like supposed to be opposition research, and the opposition research was just wrong. When you talk about the FBI not knowing this, I had asked the question earlier about them like having that information and them like not knowing that it was like, or not like speaking out against it being Russian disinformation. In what context would they have been able to speak out? Because they had the information at some point, right?
It wasn't the FBI itself that spoke out publicly and said that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation. It was former officials, many of whom still had security clearances. The reason they spoke out was because the story became public. So they would have had the same opportunity to come out and publicly denounce the Russia collusion investigation into Trump, saying this reeks of Russian disinformation once the story became public. None of them did.
Okay. So there was no like investigation into that at all. There was nobody within the FBI that was looking at that at all when it came public. Like nobody did anything about that.
Well, one, that's irrelevant to the point we're talking about. We're talking about former intel officials, some of which still had connections to the FBI or in security clearances, saying this looks like Russian disinformation.
Yeah, I know. But what I'm trying to say is that in what opportunity would they be able to have said that about Crossfire Hurricane? You're talking about when it went public, right?
When it went public. When it first started
and
being
when
released.
When it went public. When it went public, what information did the FBI have about it that it involved Dushenko?
They knew who the primary subsource was. What does that have anything to do with what we're talking about?
Because that matters. If they knew who hold on. You asked the question, man. If they knew who Igor Dushenko was and they knew that he was the one that was behind that, then it would make sense for them to speak out. I agree about that. But I need to know what they knew in order for me to say it made sense for them to speak out or not. Does that make sense?
You're conflating two groups. On one hand, you're saying, what did the FBI know about Igor Dushenko, when that's not the group we're talking about? We're talking about former intel officials. So if your question is, at what point did former intel officials know that the primary subsource was Russian? That would be a more apt question. Is that the question you're asking?
Okay, yeah, that works. Former intel officials.
Okay. One, they would still say that it would have hallmarks of Russian disinformation for reasons I could get into in a second if you want. Secondly, it eventually became public that the primary subsource was a Russian person with connections to Russian intel. So at that point, what would be their excuse at that point? Once they heard these stories that went right out of like a fucking Cold War novel with the KGB, Trump was getting pissed on in a bed where Barack Obama once slept. They call that compromise. In fact, at the time, what we were told over and over was, oh, this is straight out of the KGB playbook. This is what they do. They find American politicians and agents, etc., in compromising sexual positions. But none of them said this has the hallmarks of Russian disinformation, even though it was. No one said it, even once they knew, and they would have assumed before they knew that the source of this was Russian. The reason is because they didn't like Trump.
When the information went public, There was an investigation after that, correct?
There was already an investigation occurring when the investigation was made public.
Okay, so do you think that maybe that's the reason why they didn't feel that they needed to author a letter, because there was already something going on that was getting to the bottom of that?
There was already an investigation going on into Hunter Biden laptop when they authored that letter as well.
There was already an investigation going into the
Correct.
Hunter Biden laptop
Correct.
when they authored that?
Yes. The FBI had and was looking at Hunter Biden's laptop for months previous to that. Not only that, but there was all sorts of public disclosure, in fact, admitted at Trump's impeachment trial, even from places like the New York Times, that were like, everybody thought it was fucked up when Hunter Biden got on the board of directors at Burisma. So the difference is all of these allegations against Trump and the Russia collusion, this was like crazy shit, like he was getting pissed on, and like little people that worked for him may have had connections to Russian. Meanwhile, with the Hunter Biden story, right, we actually knew from publicly confirmed shit that, yeah, Hunter Biden did work for Burisma. Yes, the guy that works for Burisma was told by the Obama State Department to be a corrupt Russian oligarch or a corrupt Ukrainian oligarch with ties to Russia. So all of that's right there. And yet they see that. They know that 95% of the story is true. And they just say, nah, it sounds like Russian disinformation to us.
Okay. I guess my question here, because I'm trying to get to the difference between like the different situations here. Do you think that there's any situation where there's an investigation or something that you felt that the FBI should have written a letter publicly about and spoken about, regardless if there was an investigation happening or not, where they didn't?
Should they
aside
have
from
wrote
this
something,
one, obviously?
Do I ever think there's a situation where the FBI should publicly author a letter regardless if they're having an investigation or not? That's the question.
My question is, were there any situations, because I'm trying to figure this out. It's possible, and I know you're not going to grant this because I understand that you have this idea that, you know, the reason why they did this is because this and that. But I'm just trying to critically think here. Is it possible that we can imagine a situation in which the FBI, former intelligence officers, didn't write a letter about a situation where you felt that it might have been prudent for them to do it and they hadn't before in the past outside of this?
So is it hypothetically possible that a former intel official sees a story that breaks in the news, they think this story sounds like bullshit, but they didn't write a letter?
Hold on.
That's your question?
Did former intelligence officers say they thought it was bullshit?
They said they thought it had the hallmarks of Russian disinformation.
No, not that. I'm talking about the Crossfire, the Steele dossier.
No one, as to my knowledge, no former intel official wrote a public letter saying that this sounds like Russian disinformation.
Okay, so it doesn't sound like they necessarily always do that anyway, right? Because we can imagine different situations before that seemed like it was shady that they never wrote a letter for. Right?
I would
what
totally
makes this
agree.
specific situation different?
I totally agree. That's a great question. You tell me.
I would say that they just don't write letters all the time. Like you can
totally
point to times in history. No, hold on. You can point to times in history where they have done that haven't involved
Show me.
Trump.
Give me one.
I did a little bit of research on it too. Let me try and pull them up. I think this goes back to like the 90s.
Okay. So what you're going to provide me is when a bunch of former intel officials collectively came together to say that a scandal that broke out against one candidate or political party sounded like
no, you're narrowing.
disinformation.
What I'm going to show you, I guess as soon as I find it, what I'm going to show you is that there have been times where former intel agents, agents or people who have worked in these institutions, government institutions, have written public letters because they were trying to prevent something or urge the government to like act a certain way based on something that they were worried about. So
no one thinks it, but that's different than weighing in on an election. That's
but all of these things are different. All of these letters that are written. But what I'm
saying is,
it seems like you're taking issue with one of the times that they've done. No,
it seems like what you're doing. First off, we're talking about the former officials. We got onto this talking about Chris Krebs and SISA, which was a government agency that this guy was in charge of, knowing that this laptop story was real and preempting social media censoring the story by using basically the example of the laptop
I
and
don't
saying,
think we
hey, if
agreed
a
to that.
story like this comes out, it's probably Russian disinformation.
I
That's
don't
what
think
we're
we
talking
agreed.
about.
No. I don't think that we agreed to that. I think we made a distinction between what they believed, because I read the letter, and it wasn't that they didn't believe that the laptop was real. It was that they didn't believe that all the information that came from it was real. That was what we agreed on.
When you say they, who are you talking about? Chris Krebs, SISA?
Yeah, Chris Krebs, SISA, all of them are the 50 intel officers, like anybody who had spoken out and said that this
can you explain to me what the letter of these 50 former intel officials, what that has to do with Chris Krebs?
I don't know, dude. Honestly, can I be real honest right now, bro? We're hopping around a lot. I like a more like uniform just conversation. When we're hopping around a lot, it's hard for me to lose track of exactly who we're talking about. So if we're not talking about the former intel officials writing a letter, which is what I believe we were talking about, we can talk about Chris Krebs, but can we just stick to one of these things?
Well, the point was, the way we got in here was you saying the targeting of Chris Krebs is immoral. That's uniquely one of the things we see with Trump that's bad, right? And I was like, well, I don't know much about this memo. Let's look into it. Who was Chris Krebs? What was his role? You say, I don't know. I look at it, I'm like, oh, he's the head of SISA. Wasn't SISA the agency that was like at the Aspen Institute and was priming that the Hunter laptop Biden story was bullshit? And then we had all these former intel officials. And then we got focused on the former intel officials. And I was saying, well, in this case, it wasn't Russian disinformation, and they said it was. But in the case of Trump with Crossfire Hurricane, it was Russian disinformation, and none of them spoke up.
Yeah,
and
I understand that, but the information behind all of those things matters, because the context matters. All of those, if you just lay out that story alone as a list, then yeah, you can infer different reasons why people came to these conclusions, but the context matters, which is why I want to focus on one thing and just go into it. So let's just talk about the intel, the 50 former intel officers.
Okay,
right now. Would you agree? Would you agree that that isn't something that is unique to this Hunter Biden laptop situation? That
no,
they
I do
have
not.
written letters. Okay, so in 2003,
no. You ask me a question. Let me answer.
Expound. Go for it.
Yes, I think that former intel officials have at one point wrote a letter. For example, they may have wrote a letter to their local school board. They may have wrote a letter to Pizza Hut saying that the pizza they thought was good. So then you would say, well, have they ever written a letter saying that there was something that they thought was important that they wanted to talk about? Yes, I would assume that they've done that when it comes to governmental stories as well. In fact, we know more than that. We know that former intel officials are on media stations like CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS. So certainly former intel officials have written letters or publicly spoke out about stories that they saw about in the past. Have former intel officials ever came together in mass, like dozens of them, to weigh in on a story that they didn't know about on the eve of an election to say that it looked like Russian disinformation and been totally inaccurate about it? I have no idea of any remotely similar circumstance that's ever occurred in, and I welcome you to show me that that's occurred.
So what you just said is not my question, and I understand that you're adding these different aspects to what makes this different, but I don't think that those are relevant. I think that it just happens to be that you found one of these letters, which has happened since 1991. I'm looking at actually, where collectively all these. Hold on, just let me answer the question first, and then you can do your thing.
Tell me what the letter you're looking at.
Or you could let me answer the question, and I'm just going to answer the question first.
I'm going to filibuster as well when it's mine, and then eventually you'll get to reading the letter that you want to talk about.
I'm not filibustering.
Him and Ha about it. Just tell me what the
fucking letter in 91
was.
With it, man. We don't got to do this, all right? What I'm trying to tell you is that I think that you are looking at this one specific letter and thinking that it is unique because of all of these things, like all of these things around you at the time that it happened and all of that. I don't think that the time that it happened is relevant to it, because this is just something. Show me an example.
I don't believe that any former intel official. Let me finish. This will just speed it along. I don't think that any intel official has ever written a letter about anything ever. Can you show me an example you're talking about? There.
Yeah. So in that
example.
Yeah, all right. I didn't realize you were going to be that impatient. All right. 1991, 20 former intel and defense officials on the Gulf War, they wrote something about like expelling Iraq from Kuwait. It was 20 former CIA agents, actually, and Pentagon agents and State Department officials. They signed a letter to like oppose the immediate and military action. and there was a purpose behind it. The purpose was basically like a warning that the war could destabilize the region. A lot of the times people write these letters because they have a fear of something general. What I would say about the actual letter that the 50 former Intel agents wrote regarding the Hunter Biden laptop is that they were worried, like, given the context of Russians actually meddling in the election, that would be an issue and that would undermine our elections. Not to say that there aren't any other instances where elections have been undermined, but it's not necessarily something where Intel agents get together every time something happens and writes letters. I'm saying that there's a precedent for this. That's what I'm saying.
Can you show me an example of any time in history where former Intel officials en masse have came together that said that a scandal that came out about one candidate during election season was untrue?
No, I can't find you that exact
Well,
example. But what I can find you, if you let me expound on the answer, what I can find you is that former Intel agents getting together and writing on a situation isn't foreign, and all of these different letters that I could find have different context to it. So the context of the 50 Intel agencies writing the letter about Hunter Biden laptop is going to be different from the one from 1998, from the one from 2003, from the one from 1991. It just seems that you're looking at the context of that one and you're saying because it's different, that means it's unprecedented, when all of these letters have been different.
I'm not even using the word unprecedented. I would say it's nearly unprecedented, possibly unprecedented. However, there is two things. There is former officials saying, I think this would be good policy or bad policy. And then there are former officials during an election saying, I think that this scandal is bullshit.
Yeah. Do you understand my reasoning why I believe that was the case?
I understand that your bias is leading you to say, no, there's no distinction there.
So do you understand my reason why I believe that's the case?
Let me finish. I understand that any objective person would disagree with you. They would say there is clearly a difference between Intel officials weighing in to benefit one political party and one political candidate over the other, with no evidence suggesting that a major scandal on the eve of the election must be disinformation. That is completely different than Intel officials saying, we think this invasion is a mistake, or we think that this economic policy is a mistake. Weighing in on policies is different than weighing in to put your thumb on the scale in an election season. I think that almost every objective person would agree with that. And you just hand wave it away by saying, oh, no, that distinction doesn't matter. Clearly, they feared that Russia was interfering, so therefore it's okay.
Okay, so can you explain why I believe that is the case?
Because you're biased, because you're making excuses for the obvious double standard and bias when it comes to our intel agencies, because you don't want to admit the truth. That these agencies clearly, as Chuck Schumer said, they would find 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at Trump. You don't want to come to that conclusion. So instead, you're jumping through as many hoops as possible to explain why these agents were incorrect when they didn't speak up about the disinformation against Trump that was sourced from Russians, but why they did speak up also being incorrect against the Hunter Biden laptop story, which they were incorrect on again. Both stories hurt Trump. Both actions by those agencies hurt Trump.
Let's try this, because I think you're just going to call me biased and not try to understand my actual position. So do you agree that, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions, do you agree that letters written by former Intel agents, multiple former Intel agents, about something that the government is going to do, or that the government has done, or something that involves U.S. policy or just anything like that, has been written for the purpose of avoiding something that they felt would be harmful to the nation?
Yes.
Okay.
We've already gone through all this, but
do you agree? Hold on. Do you agree that former Intel agents or former Intel workers, all that stuff, they would write letters in order to avoid or warn against something that could be harmful to the nation?
Yes.
Do you think that it's possible that, given the fact that Russians have been interfering with our elections, that 50 Intel agents may have written a letter because they believe that the meddling in elections would be harmful to the nation?
No.
Okay.
Any more
questions? So
questions?
You just don't believe, hold on. So you just don't believe that it's possible that, even though they have a history of writing letters when they feel that something is harmful to the nation, that their actual reason for writing this wasn't that, but instead it was some sort of nefarious plot?
Yes, I believe the circumstantial evidence and specific evidence we have strongly suggest that. I answered your questions with brevity. I'll ask you to do the same. Will you agree that there's ever been a time where a presidential administration has targeted an official for potential crimes? An official from the other party for potential crimes? Yes or no would suffice.
I
understand. Okay. So your argument is there has never been a time when a presidential administration has targeted an official from the other party for potential crimes. That's your argument? That's never happened.
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. Explain going after Donald Trump and his people through the Biden administration.
Yeah, what did the Biden administration do specifically? They went
after Trump's lawyers. They went after Steve Bannon. They went after Peter Navarro. They went after Trump and were investigating him. You didn't know this?
When
this is news to you?
Hold on. No, because I'm trying to figure something out here. You said the Biden administration.
Correct.
I feel like you're making a specific allegation against specific people, right? So who was the individual that went against these, that went after these people? Who were the individuals that went after these people?
There were plenty of people. For example, we had someone at Biden's DOJ that decided to go take a demotion and go work for Bragg's office so that he could directly go after Trump for that bullshit charge. We know that people in the Biden DOJ, for example, Merrick Garland appointed a special counsel to investigate Trump and investigate him for that. You don't disagree with that? Jack Smith, correct?
Yeah. So is it unique for any administration outside of like the hold on. Just give me 1 second, breathe.
I'm not interested in your equivocating. I'm refusing to answer whatever you ask.
I understand that you're not.
I generously answered your questions. I generously answered your question. No. You did not. You admit that you were incorrect. Admit that you were incorrect, or I'm uninterested in answering your counterfactual question to me.
Hold on. I'm incorrect. Hold on.
Thank you. That's all that matters.
No, hold on. I'm asking you. You're not trying to understand anything I'm saying. I'm incorrect. No, because I'm asking you a question and you're saying correct. I'm incorrect about what?
You were incorrect when you said that you were unaware of any example in history where an administration has gone after an official from the other party.
I said, not that I know of, I'm unsure.
Okay, will you admit now that you're incorrect?
That an administration, okay, hold on. This requires clarification, right? When you say an administration, you're talking about the broader, like the DOJ, like the entire government itself, right?
Yes.
Correct? Okay,
yes.
If that's the case, then yeah, we've seen administration investigate the opposite parties before. However,
okay, no, I'm not interested in however. Notice when I answered you.
Blocking your ears and you're not want to hear my answer.
When I answered you,
notice
when I answered you, I answered simply yes or no. That's what I did. When I answered you,
Three questions.
Why can't you give me the same courtesy? Why can't you give me the same courtesy? I have a string of questions. I have a string of questions, just like you. When you said, "Will you admit that they have written letters?" Yes. Will you admit that it's possible because they're concerned they don't want them to happen? Yes. See how I answered those yes or no and allowed you to string out your questions? Why are you unwilling to do the same for me? Why are you unwilling to give me the same courtesy I gave you?
You really got to calm down. This is a calm conversation. You're acting crazy, bro. You're acting crazy. Relax.
I'm asking you. Don't tell me to relax. I'm asking you to give me the same courtesy
I wouldn't tell
gave
you if you didn't need it, bro. Listen, you asked the yes or no question. You asked the yes or no question. What was my honest answer? Do you remember what it was?
Your answer was yes. After you changed your answer from no.
No, it was not. You don't remember what I said, and that's why you're angry. I do
remember what you said.
What you had asked me, was there a time where past administration has done like blah, 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 blah. And I said, I'm not certain, no. That was essentially what I had said. Once you had said something, the reason why once you add context to it, my uncertainty goes away because I have more information. That's called being honest.
It's the answer, yes or no.
I gave you the answer, but what did you understand? When you described it,
your original answer was no, and then you changed it to yes. That's what I said. You said no. That's not what I said.
My original answer was I was uncertain, and then you gave me information.
This is an unproductive conversation because you're
because you're angry. I'm not being bad faith. Would you calm down?
Angry. I'm frustrated at your blatant bad faithness.
No one is being bad faith. You think
You are
everyone's bad
being
faith.
bad
Just
faith.
calm down.
You're being bad faith. I
I'm
gave
not
you the
being
courtesy.
bad faith.
You
Just
were asking
relax.
me. If you tell me to relax one more time, you're out of here, and I'm never talking to you again. You can
All
start
right,
your
but it's
own
cool
show
for you
and
to
then
scream,
tone
right?
police people. You can tone police people on your own show. I don't give a fuck.
I'm not
going to
tone
relax.
policing you,
I'm
dog.
getting
I'm trying
frustrated
to
by
have
your
a
bad
productive
faith.
conversation.
I'm getting frustrated
Nobody's
by your
being
bad faith. Now I'm going to explain what happened here. You asked me a string of questions, which I gave you yes/no questions, which were ridiculous in nature.
You said
I
this
talked.
before.
If you can't stop interrupting, I'm going to have to let you go, right? These questions that you were asking me were designed to be like, well, if A exists, and I'm like, yeah, it exists, and B exists, yeah, well, then C could exist. And I'm like, I disagree. I don't think C could exist. Here's my reasons why. But let me play the same game. What I was going to do if you were good faith would be this. I would say, has there ever been a time when an administration went after someone for potential crimes in the other party? You would clearly say, of course that's happened. I'd say, okay, and would you admit that it's entirely possible that the reason they were doing that was because they legitimately thought crimes were occurring? And you would say yes. And I'd say, therefore the Chris Krebs memo could be because Trump legitimately thinks that Chris Krebs committed crimes. And you're going to say, well, I don't think so because of blah, blah, blah. And I would say, yes, that's exactly the argument that I'm making when it comes to these former intel officials. Yes, there have been times in the past where they have said, we don't recommend this particular policy. What I'm unaware of is them weighing in, particularly on the eve of an election, about a scandal and being incorrect about it. That's what I'm unaware of. I'm unaware of not just those two things happening together, but them weighing in on a political scandal. Not should we invade this country? Should we cut rates? Should we enter into a trade deal? Not that. That's understandable that former officials will have opinions. But to weigh in, to put your thumb on the scale of an election and say, I don't believe this scandal is true, that's what seems unusual to me. And you're ignoring the circumstance by going, but isn't it true that they could write letters? Yes. And isn't it true they've written letters about things they would think would harm the country if they didn't speak up? Yes, I guess that could be true. Well, therefore, couldn't it be true that that's what they're doing here? No, I don't believe that. That's the point that I'm trying to make. I was trying, if you would have given me the same courtesy that I gave you, it would have illustrated to you, oh, I see why you're saying that you don't think my line of questioning leads to the conclusion that I'm trying to get to, because if you run that exact experiment in reverse about the Chris Krebs memo, I clearly would come to a different conclusion. But I can't do that because you're bad faith. Because you're like, well, no, I don't think that any administration ever has investigated an opponent. And then I have to be like, oh, fucking okay. So let's look at just the last administration. You're like, well, blah, blah, blah. I guess the answer is yes, but no, I didn't say no. It's fucking ridiculous. Everyone listening knows it. That's why I'm raising my voice. I'm getting frustrated because it's like fucking pulling teeth, because I'm able to clearly answer questions and you're incapable of it.
Bro, it's been like 2 minutes. Just, okay, let me answer you. When you say that I'm being bad faith, the reality of what actually happened was that I said that I was uncertain because I hedged an answer based on my understanding of my knowledge of the situation. And then once you gave me information, I said, okay, the question here in my head and understandably requires more information for me to give you a yes or no question, or else I was just going to keep giving you, I don't know. And that would have been unsatisfying. So once you talked about the prior administration doing this, I asked you, okay, wait, are you talking about like the executive branch specifically? Or are we talking about the whole DOJ? Because I'm curious what we're trying to discuss. And then you blew a gasket, bro. I'm not being bad faith. I'm being very good faith. I don't think you trust people too much.
No, the reason was, even after that, I said, okay, now you say yes, now moving on. And you're like, wait. Let me explain myself. I said, no, I'm not interested in the explanation. I gave you the effort of just answering short and sweet so that you could make your line of argumentation. Will you give me the same courtesy? You said,
this is what I'll say.
I need to respond. But you already said, once you said, okay, yes, that's all I needed to hear, because everyone that's objectively in good faith would understand, of course, there's been times when sitting administration has investigated people from the other party for potential crimes. Of course that's happened.
And once I understood what you were talking about and you asked a further question, like, you got to understand, there's going to be times where I'm going to ask you for clarification before I blanket agree to something. That's the best thing.
And once more,
because that's an honest conversation.
And once more, that's not the criticism I'm making. I thought that the ask for
I
clarification.
think we're talking past each
Please
other.
let me
Maybe
finish.
I should just
I
agree.
thought that the ask for clarification was ridiculous because it was such an easy yes. But fine, we got past through the clarification and you got to yes. I was like, great, we got to yes. Can we move on? You then at that point, it had nothing to do with clarifying my question. You refused to leave the answer just be yes. You said, no, no, no. I have to keep going. I have to keep going. I said, okay, you said yes. Why can't we just move to the next point?
All right, Rob,
That's the
I
courtesy.
agree.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
That's the courtesy I gave you. You started saying, oh, you're yelling. No, you tell me what my answer was. I said, your answer was initially no, then you said yes. You said no, that wasn't it. Then you
Because
had
that
to
wasn't it.
re-explain yourself for 2 minutes. And I'm like, whatever, the answer is yes now. Can we move on? No, I need to keep explaining. It was clarifications, blah, blah, blah. That's my criticism. The clarification point of this was done. You said yes. I was willing to move on with your answer being yes. You would not let me move on. That's the problem.
Bro, you know what? Say what you want about you, but you're pretty entertaining, man. I'm laughing
Thank
right
you.
now.
I
This is a
tried.
good time. However,
You're frustrated.
bro, I think we talked past each other. I don't think you comprehended what I'm saying, but that's okay because
I
just
do
want to move the
comprehend what you're
conversation
saying.
forward.
I'll steel man your argument. Actually, there's a
No,
solid
you did.
chance.
You just tried, but
I'll
you
steel
got
man
it wrong. But I don't care.
Right now. I'll steel man your argument right now. You tell me where I'm wrong. Actually, these 52 former Intel officials, there have been times in the past when Intel officials have spoken up when they thought that there was something that was dangerous to the United States and it was worth speaking up. And because they saw Russian interference in the 2016 election, they were hyper-focused on that potentially swinging the 2020 election. And so they spoke up because they saw hallmarks in the Hunter Biden laptop story of what may have been Russian disinformation. That's why they spoke up, not because they were trying to help the Bidens or harm Trump. They spoke up because they legitimately thought that this was a potential effort by Russia to interfere in the election.
Okay, for sure. But I want it to be clear that I don't misunderstand your answer either and your reasoning. It seems that you just don't think that that's the reason why they did that. You think that this specific, them writing these 50 Intel agents, officers writing this letter is unique from the other cases because the other cases are more policy based and they're more like, okay, they're trying to put their thumb on the, or trying to offer suggestions for policy. You think that this one is specific because it's unique from all of the other ones, given the fact that it has to do with targeting or like exonerating basically one political party and more so throwing another one under the bus. I understand that you think that that's unique. We agree. I agree with how you feel and how I feel. But what I'm trying to say and what I was trying to move on to was the fact that I think that you feel that this one is particularly unique as opposed to some of the other ones, which are all unique from each other because it involves something that I think that you care about. The politicization of the government and something that, them attacking Trump. I think that you are looking more at the details of this one and what makes it unique rather than if we were to go through all of these and look at the unique attributes of each of them. My argument is just that all of these are unique.
That's not okay. One, I've been talking about the circumstantial evidence. I haven't even got to the most specific evidence yet, which I'll get to here in a second. But I think that the circumstantial evidence that I was talking about, that none of these officials, none of them spoke up about the disinformation that harmed Trump in 2016. And so many of them spoke up against what they claimed was the hallmarks of disinformation this time. And they were wrong in both accounts and in both accounts it harmed Trump. And I'm unaware of this ever happening in history where they weighed in on a political scandal story like this. However, the direct evidence, Anthony Blinken, who was a senior advisor to Biden's 2020 campaign, contacted Michael Morrell and other signatories of that letter and asked them to sign that letter. And Michael Morrell testified in front of the House Judiciary Committee that one of the purposes for that was to, quote, give Biden a talking point in the debate. So now we have evidence testimony that someone directly from Biden's team reached out to these former officials and said, we need a talking point. We know this story's broke and it's going to hurt Biden in the debate. Could you give us a talking point to help us? If your argument's true that this wasn't to weigh in on politics and it wasn't to help one political side or the other, why did Biden's team reach out and request their signatures, which they then got?
If that is true, then my argument wouldn't hold weight. Can you show me where that had happened? Like,
yes. Yes. Let me find it. Let's see here.
You're all fired up, buddy.
Well, I'm always fired up. Here, can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Okay. This is from CBS and Catherine Herridge in May 10th, 2023.
Whoa,
64
buddy,
page.
the mainstream media? That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, I knew you wouldn't accept anything else, right?
I don't really read the news or watch the news. But.
In the final weeks of the 2020 campaign, 51 former top intel officials signed a letter saying that the alleged contents of Hunter Biden laptop had all the classic earmarks of Russian disinformation. The statement was allegedly designed to aid Joe Biden's presidential candidacy, and its dissemination was coordinated through the Biden campaign, including to an interim report by the GOP House-led Judiciary Committee. The 64 report reviewed by CBS states that the House investigators wrote to all 51 of the former officials requesting relevant documents and testimony. The report contains portions of witness interviews. The report maintains that the emails at the time from former intel officials, including former acting CIA director Michael Morrell, former CBS News contributor, show that the statement was meant to help candidate Biden in the final weeks of the 2020 campaign after the New York Post first reported on the alleged son's laptop. Information on the computer came into possession of a Delaware computer repair owner. According to the GOP report, contemporaneous emails show the organizers' intent in drafting and releasing the statement. We think Trump will attack Biden on the issue at this week's debate, and we want to offer perspectives on this from Russia watchers and other seasoned experts, and we want to give the vice president a talking point to use in response. During the debate on October 22nd, 2020, in response to Trump's taunts, if the laptop from hell, Biden pushed back. There are 50 former national intel folks who said that he accused me of Russian plans. They've said this has all the characteristics. 4 or 5 former heads of the CIA, both parties were saying a bunch of garbage. Nobody believes him except his friend Rudy Giuliani. So they have the actual emails and testimony from people like Michael Morrell saying, yes, we were reached out to and said, hey, we want you to give us talking points that says that this could come from Russia so that Biden could push back in the debate. Sufficient for you?
So no, because unlike most people, I wouldn't use a news article just to substantiate that. The letters that the emails that they're talking about, I would need to actually see those in order to be certain.
Okay.
Because...
so we'll see. And so...
And also the other thing I want to say, a lot of people, like, they do this thing where they'll cite what the GOP said about the Democrats said about, bro, Congress is crazy. I don't trust a word that any of them say about each other. They're obviously going to say certain things. So if a GOP led investigation produces the actual receipts, I'll look at those, but I'm not going to take them at face value or an ABC article, which isn't to say this isn't a start.
This is, what's this from? This is from Fox. Let's see. What's this from? April. Let's see if I get the dates right in this. May. No, that's not going to help. All right. So now you want me. So you're just writing this up. You're saying, nope, it's not enough that this was reported on. Now we need to see the actual, most of them, which will be classified documents from the congressional hearing. Then you'll accept it. Okay. So
no, hold on. Let me answer that. So there's no, hold on. Let me clarify so there's no confusion about what I said. I'm not writing it off. I explicitly said this is a start. It's just that when I'm actually looking for definitive evidence on a thing, I would stop short of just believing an article alone. People call themselves skeptics. I'm more of a skeptic than a lot of people actually when it comes to... I
disagree with that. You're not skeptical at all. You have selective skepticism. When it harms Donald Trump, your skepticism goes out the window. When it benefits Trump, then you're very skeptical.
That's interesting. I don't think so. But
you've made many claims. I
didn't really make much claims. We didn't really talk about too much. Like, we talked about like one major thing, and even then I was just asking for clarification. I was looking for evidence. That's all I was doing. I didn't come to any like definitive conclusion.
So here is from the House Judiciary, right? I'm putting it up on the screen. This is directly from the House Judiciary Committee. New testimony reveals Secretary Blinken and Biden campaign behind infamous public statement on the Hunter Biden laptop. Chairman Jordan and Turner demand documents communications from Blinken. New testimony by Michael Morrell, a former deputy director at the CIA and one of the 51 signatories of the public statement in the Hunter Biden emails, revealed that U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, then senior advisor to the Biden campaign, was the impetus for the public statement signed on October 20 that falsely implied the New York Post reporting about the Hunter Biden product was Russian disinformation. In response, House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan and House Intelligence Committee Mike Turner sent a letter to Secretary Blinken demanding documents. Background: on October 14, 2020, New York Post published a story. Within 5 days, 51 former intel officials signed a public statement. New information. The committee's recently conducted transcribed interview with Michael Morrell, a former deputy director of the CIA and one of 51 signatories of the public statement. In his transcribed interview, Morrell testified that on or around October 17, 2020, Blinken served as a senior advisor to the Biden campaign and reached out to him to discuss the Hunter Biden laptop story. According to Morrell, although your outreach was couched as simply gathering Morrell's reaction to the Post story, it set in motion the events that led to the issuance of the public statement. That same day, October 17th, Blinken also emailed Morrell an article published by USA Today alleging that the FBI was examining whether the Hunter Biden laptop was part of a disinformation campaign. The very bottom of the email he sent to Morrell included the signature block of Andrew Bates, then director of the Rapid Response for Biden campaign. Morrell testified that his communication with Blinken was one of the few communications he had with the Biden campaign, explaining that he also received a call from Steve Ricchetti, chairman of the Biden campaign, following the October 22nd debate, to thank him for writing the statement. Morrell also explained that the Biden campaign helped to strategize about the public release of the statement. Morrell further explained that one of his two goals in releasing the statement was to help then Vice President Biden in the debate and to assist him in winning the election. Based on Morrell's testimony, it's apparent that the Biden campaign played an active role in the origins of the public statement, which had the effect of helping suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story and preventing American citizens from making a fully informed decision. So that's directly from the House Judiciary Committee. Is that good enough for you?
Yeah, remember what I said before about Congress? I'm looking for the actual emails that they're talking about.
So now an official document saying we looked at his testimony. That's not enough.
I don't think that you disagree with this. Do you think that it's possible that if you hear something from the Democrats and they're reporting on like something that Trump did or something like that alone, that would be enough evidence? Or would you want to see the actual receipts? Come on.
How many times do we get to see actual closed-door testimony? Has Michael Morrell, this is common knowledge. It's not been disputed. Michael Morrell hasn't said this isn't the case.
Didn't Blinken testify against this? So it's like there's two conflicting stories here, right? If there's two conflicting stories from both parties, I'm not going to listen to either of them. I'm going to look for like source data, and if I can't get it, I'm not going to come to a conclusion about something. Like I don't trust politicians, bro.
Okay, 1 second. The hoops that I have to jump through.
This isn't hoops. This is me asking for receipts.
It's not. There's the circumstantial evidence already showed for reasons we went through. Then when I have actual congressional House like stories that reported this, then you're like, nope, just the news isn't enough. Then I go to the actual House Judiciary Committee that says this was directly what the testimony was. Nope, I need to see the exact words and transcription. That's where we're at now.
No, you showed me the House Judiciary Committee saying that there was an email that stated that like Anthony actually had ordered this. Like, if there's facts of the matter that Anthony had ordered this, I'm cool with admitting that. But I genuinely just don't believe politicians. If a politician from one party says something about another, I'm not going to take it at face value. I just like receipts. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the best faith that you can get, bro. And I feel like you'd probably be able to relate as someone who, is a populist in a sense.
It's horseshit.
You know I'm valid. So
I just want to ask you, all of this stuff, have you seen all the stuff you're going to complain about Trump? You have seen the official transcribed, not just talking points from Democrats. Everything that you complain about Trump, you've seen official transcribed documents, not what the Democrats said about it, not what Democrat committees said. Same with the January 6th committee. You're not just listening to what the Democrat-led January 6th committee. You're only yourself before you make any decisions. Your threshold of evidence is I need to see the original source. And if it's classified, if we're unable to see it, I can't have an opinion on whether or not it existed or not, because only when I see the original transcribed interview, the original emails, am I able to make a conclusion. That's your argument. I'm correct?
No. Let me explain it quickly. You explained a great deal of it. Basically, when I'm getting information on something, I like to know for certain that I can source it back to its original claim. When it comes to claims about Trump from Democrats, I do not believe them from Democrats immediately because I know that they are Democrats. They're going to say the exact opposite. So as far down as I can get to the truth, I'm going to stop there. And if I stop there and it's still not source material, then I'm going to either withhold an opinion without enough evidence surrounding it, or I'm just going to disregard it altogether and not even use that argument because it's not something that I could objectively say is the case. That's my argument.
All right, so I have this here. I don't believe you. You're full of shit, and this is
See, that's the
exactly.
thing. Hold on, here's the problem. Hold on, I just really want to explain something.
I don't
really
believe you.
quickly,
Your
Robbie.
threshold
Really
for your
quickly,
standard of
my
evidence.
friends.
Your threshold
Really
for your
quickly,
standard of evidence is
my
bullshit.
friends,
It's absolute
my
bullshit.
bestie,
Your threshold.
bestie.
Your threshold for your standard of evidence is absolutely bullshit. You have a double standard when it comes to evidence that helps Trump versus harms Trump. It's clear for everyone to see. And I'll provide more and more evidence, which you'll continue to say it's not enough, it's not enough, it's not enough. And inevitably, I provide you evidence that would be enough to say it's enough. You'll be like, yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal anyways. This argument didn't really matter.
Rob, my best friend in the world. Can I explain something to you? And I
don't
mean this in the meanest way. I feel like you start off with the belief that everyone's bad faith and biased. And I think that clouds your ability to have a genuine conversation about the facts in these things when someone's coming to you in good faith. Mm-hmm. Because it doesn't matter. It just sounds like no matter what I do, you're just going to say, I don't believe you. So then at that point, like, where do we go with the conversation if you're just going to say, I don't believe you? Like, what are we doing, man? Mm-hmm. In another world, we would be best friends, okay?
I don't believe you. I don't believe you.
Undertaker. All right.
I don't believe you.
All right. I can literally say anything this entire conversation, then, and it won't matter because you don't believe whatever I say. I can literally lie this whole time now.
That's true. I don't believe you.
So what's the point of that?
Well, okay. We'll see you later.
No, man. Let's not do that. Let's just engage in good faith. And like, if you say something, I'm gonna believe you at face value. And if I say something,
I don't believe you.
How about that?
I do not believe you.
Okay, that's fine. But you just pulled up something that might be evidence. You could sway me. What is this anyway? Like, what are we looking at on the screen?
It's sort of one of the emails from Michael Morrell that was released in the Freedom of Information Act. It says, good morning. I hope everyone had a nice day. Attaches a statement that Mark and I drafted that many former and senior working level officials across the IC will sign, and then it will be made public. We're 100% confident it does not contain classified information. Indeed, it specifically says we don't know what the IC or FBI knows. This is a rush job, and it needs to get out as soon as possible. Thank you very much. That was sent to the CIA, I believe someone at the CIA, which then they rushed along in 6 hours. Wasn't the document that will serve any sort of proof to you because your standards of proof are fucking unreasonable.
Well, could you actually send that to me?
Please. No, I can't send you shit. You could look it up for yourself. I don't give a fuck. Your standards are unreasonable. I'm going to find the documents that say this, and then I'm going to prove to you that it exists. If I can find those documents, whether it be the actual transcript of Morrell's testimony or him publicly being interviewed from a media source saying this is true, and when I find it, I'm kicking you and never talking to you again. You can talk all you fucking want until then.
This is so wild. Like, I thought we were getting along, to be honest. I thought we were getting close.
You could think that's fine.
Bro, hold on. Just real man to man real quick. I don't think you understand, bro. You make a lot of good points, right? And I understand your position, where you're coming from and why you're worried about certain things. As someone who does think, the Democrats go too far, as someone who doesn't necessarily trust first sources, as someone who thinks that all my life, I've always thought that mainstream media, like, it's the last person I'm going to go because they're usually like disrelated and everything. I'm trying to come to you with good faith, man, but I just genuinely don't think that however I come at this, you're like going to trust what I'm saying. But I feel like that needs to be open in order for this to happen. I just want to see the letter or the email. If you show me the email and it's facts down to what you say, I'm going to agree. I don't have any loyalty to people I do not know.
I don't give a fuck anything you're saying. You're a piece of shit who I'm uninterested in talking to after I provide this evidence. I don't give a shit.
Well, shit, that's sad because we could have been best friends, bro. Like, besties, for real. Wait, are you actually sending?
I'm looking.
Or are you
I'm
looking
looking
up something
for.
else?
I'm looking for the evidence that you're requiring. That's what I'm doing.
Hey, and what I'll say was, if it doesn't exist, then I can't say either way that Lincoln was right or the GOP was right. Like, I'll just have a neutral stance on it. I'll say I have to look at other evidence in order to come to a conclusion that this may be true or not. But I'm just the kind of person where it's like, I'd like to see.
You're not. You're a second shit liar. You're a second shit liar. Your standard will be markedly different when it comes to when it comes to these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is unfortunate.
That's fair. You can think that. All the more reason for you not to talk to me anymore. No problem.
No, man, come on, bro. I'm gonna still respect you after this, bro. Like you're tripping. It's not that deep.
Let's see.
If you don't want to go down this lane too, we could also just move on to something else.
No. I'm more than happy to go down this lane and have this be the end of the conversation. No problem.
Okay. So I was curious about, J6.
I don't. Your curiosity means nothing to me.
Jesus Christ.
Let's see.
This is kayfabe, right?
No.
What?
Do you remember what my entire argument was on the Sarah panel that you joined? Can you refresh what that argument was?
Yeah, the actual argument was essentially, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that like if you haven't, if you are silent on democratic corruption or you basically encourage it, then you should be laughed at when you criticize Trump's corruption because you basically enabled that when it came to someone you disagreed with. Right?
I actually wasn't listening to you.
Why did you ask me to say it again, bro?
Because I think I found what I'm looking for.
I'm very confused.
Okay, here we go. Here's the official transcript. What page are we on here? Page 18. This is the official transcript from Morell's testimony, former head of the CIA. Now, I want to make sure that you'll accept all levels of proof here. One, do you acknowledge this as judiciary.house.gov website? I'll place the link for you so that you can see it. That link will be in the chat of my audience. I want you to look at that link and determine that I haven't manufactured anything, that this is actually a .gov website. Just do that step first, please.
Unlike you, I believe that you're not manipulating.
Please. You don't have to pontificate. Just do that.
Hold on, do what? Just say that I acknowledge it?
I want you to click that link that I put in the chat so that you can acknowledge that this goes to an official.
My fault. The stream chat. I was looking at Twitter.
Correct.
I still don't have anything in the stream chat.
You didn't see it in the stream. Okay. Would you like me to put it in the private chat here? I could do that. Yeah. If I can figure that out. Okay, private chat. You go there. I'm pasting a link. I want you to click on that link and see that it doesn't rickroll you. It doesn't go to Breitbart. Right? Got it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. You let me know when you click on it and you acknowledge that this, to the best of your incredible skepticism, appears in fact to be an actual government document.
Yes.
You acknowledge that.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
You could ask whatever. Your skepticism is so intense that I would welcome you asking any question that you have about this. Go for it.
You're right. I should probably control it. It's a little all over the place.
You're good. Go for it. Ask your question.
Remind me who Michael Morell is again.
Former head of the CIA. One of the intel officials that signed. Okay, we good?
Perfect.
Now, will you acknowledge that the title of this document, which you can see on the screen, is Committee on the Judiciary, U.S. House of Representatives, Washington, D.C., interview of Michael Morell, Tuesday, April 4th, 2023. Will you acknowledge that that's what it says?
Yes, that's exactly
okay.
What it says, Rob.
Thank you. All right, that's what it
word
says.
For word.
Now, we're going to search Blinken. The reason I'm word searching Blinken is because I have read this testimony before, but I have not in quite some time, and it's a 132-page document. So we're getting to the central claim of, did Anthony Blinken request that people in the intel officials make this sort of letter? Would you say that's fair to search, or do you insist that I read the entire 130-page document to you?
No, you obviously don't have to do that, man.
Very well. Okay, so now we're searching the term Blinken. Question. In his email to Nick Shapiro, you said that you would, quote, explain tomorrow on the phone how this came to be, meaning this public statement. And I will enter in an email into the record so you can get a copy of it. We have entered this one into record, the previous one. Can you tell us what you said to Mr. Shapiro during the call? Morrell says, sure, I told him that I received a call from Tony Blinken, then a senior official at the Biden campaign, asking me if I'd seen the New York Post story. If my memory serves, then, I don't exactly know how you want to do this, but my memory's sketchy, right? It's a long time ago. I believe I said I had not seen it. I believe he summarized it for me, and he asked me if I thought the Russians may have been involved in any way to show the emergence of these emails. I should also say I don't know whether he called me or sent me an email, just to be clear. Initiating the call, but for the U.S. Today article he forwarded. He either called or emailed me. Right. At this time, I was regularly deleting my emails because something had happened with the director, Brennan, in late 2015. So all the emails I received as part of this, right, some of those emails have been deleted. So it's possible he sent me an email. It's possible he called me. Jordan says there were two separate communications. That was first call or email, and then there was a subsequent email with the USA Today article. Yes, sir, says Morrell. Jordan says, what was the time of the email? Morrell says, so I don't know for sure, Congressman, but I believe he called to ask the question first and then followed up with the email. Close together? Morrell says, I think, given the timestamps here, I feel that, when I say, Congressman, I was just wondering if you guys think the Russians played in the Hunter Biden thing. That was 2:16 p.m. on the 17th. He sent me the USA Today article later that day. Now, you acknowledge this is already Morrell saying before he signed on to this letter, he was contacted by a member of Biden's team who said, hey, do you think Russians could have had something to do with this? You acknowledge that his testimony is that so far, correct?
Yes, that's literally what we read.
Okay, that would seem to strongly suggest that I was correct already before we get deeper into
what
this.
What are you talking about? No, it doesn't. It suggests that Blinken called him and asked him, yo, did you see that? Do you think the Russians did anything? That's literally all it says.
What it suggests is that these people didn't write this letter based on their own prompting. They were prompted by the Biden administration.
You're making your own inferences. Let's go off of what it says. What it says is that he called him, he asked him if he saw it, and he asked him if he thought that it had anything to do with it. That's what it says.
What it suggests is that he didn't come up with this on his own, that he was in direct communication with people in the Biden administration that fed him the exact story that he would end up writing.
You can make the argument that he inceptioned him. That's fine, but that's not what this says. We can keep going. Blinken shows up 33 times. Your point might actually show up.
Yes or no? Does this show that the first time, or that previous to Morrell writing or signing on to this letter, that the allegations within the letter that it was Russian was suggested by the Biden administration to him before he signed on to the letter? Yes or no?
I'm reading back. I'm not like hemming and hawing. Just relax, okay? No, sure, I tell the mercy to call Blinken and senior official. I don't know exactly what to do this. Summarized for me asking thoughts of the Russian. I believe he summarized for me and asked me if I thought the Russians may have been involved in any way. The emergence of the emails. So that was, I should say, I don't know whether he called me or whether he was sent. Does Morrell say that he didn't think anything about the Russians prior to that, or did he just say that Tony had asked him if he thought that the Russians had anything to do with it? Because I'm not seeing the part where he said this is like the first time he was like ever thought about. He
says that he didn't even know about the story until this was brought to his attention. That's what the testimony showed. Regardless,
okay,
I don't know why.
Yeah, I skip that. Yeah, I acknowledge that then. Yes, okay. I acknowledge that.
Okay, we'll continue. Now we're on page 21. My memory, when he called you, did he suggest, insinuate that you should write the letter and statement? My memory is he did not, right? My memory is he asked me what I thought. Question, okay, it wasn't the campaign could use some help, could you? He did not say that. It was not my memory that he said that. Tony and I, that's Anthony Blinken, we're fairly close. I would say we were close friends, but Tony and I were fairly close during our time in government. When he was vice president, national security advisor, when he was president, Obama's national security advisor, I would be the person he would reach out to with these questions. When we saw each other post the Obama administration, we'd have conversations about what was going on in the world. He would ask me questions. So it was natural for him to do that. But, he asked me a specific question here. I have to tell you what his intent, right, in asking me. He'll have to tell you his intent. My thinking was if I agreed, right, that the Russians were somehow involved, my guess is he would want that out. But this is a guess, right? I don't know his intent. Prior to the call, do you have any intent to write this statement? I did not. So the call triggered this. Yes, it did. Absolutely. Question. Okay. And then in the exhibit I just handed you, I see the email from Secretary Blinken was originally sent to him by Andrew Bates, the director of rapid response from the Biden campaign and White House press secretary. Do you have any reason to believe Secretary Blinken was directed by the Biden campaign to enlist you to write this statement? I don't know that, he says. Did he mention communication with Andrew Bates? He did not. Or on the phone with you. Do you believe you were enlisted by the Biden campaign to write this statement? I can't guess their intent. Matt Gaetz then. Mr. Morrell, you're aware of other individuals that Blinken contacted? No, I'm not aware. Question: do you have any reason to believe the Biden campaign planted the USA story titled "A Tabloid Trove Data Hunter Biden"? Blah, blah blah. The same article they sent you. I don't believe they did. Question: do you know whether Blinken
Hold
or
on,
Andrew
real quick before you go on. Stop. I want to just see. Do you acknowledge that so far, what we've read is that he didn't have the idea about this beforehand, but he doesn't know anything, or there was no like suggesting from Tony Blinken specifically to write it. It's just that the idea didn't occur beforehand, and he has no idea about the intent for him to have tried to influence him to write it. Do you acknowledge that's what that says?
He is saying that he does not know what the intent was of Blinken reaching out to him. However, he would not have wrote this else from the prompting of Blinken. That's what he says.
Which implies inspiration on his part, but not an intentional plan for Blinken to make him do that. Correct?
No, that's we could come to our own conclusion why Blinken would have reached out to him. I think it's clear.
That's fine, but if we're going off of this test, if we're going off of this testimony, Morrill specifically said he does not know that. He does not know these.
That is correct. He is saying. Do you know what I'm thinking right now?
Yeah. Okay. So
you do. Do you know? You know what I'm thinking right now?
No. Sorry, I thought you were.
So
saying
therefore, if you were called in front of congressional.
I misunderstood what you just said. Yeah, I misunderstood what you just said.
You acknowledge. Great. So now I'm accepting your answer that you misunderstood what I said, and your answer is no, you don't know what I said. Therefore, I'll follow up with my next question instead of you hemming and hawing and explaining that you misunderstood for the next 2 minutes. And what I'll say is, okay, you didn't understand what I said. I clarified. Now you admit no. Therefore, if you were called to testify about this exchange in Congress and they said, was Rob's intent X, you would say, I don't know his intent. Yes. Great. That's what anyone would say about anything unless they're specifically told that they would say, I can't speak to exactly what their intent was. However, we already got the most important part of this, which was that this person, Morrell, was never intending to write this letter until he was contacted by a member of the Biden team, which prompted him to write the letter. Okay, moving on. Question. Do you have any reason to believe that the Biden campaign planted the story? Oh, we already did that. Do you know whether Blinken or Bates had contact with the USA Today? Blah, blah, blah. Morrell says, so it seems right. It seems the campaign was asked about questions about the USA Today and did provide material because, you could read it to see it. So I'm sure they did. There's a 100% chance of certainty. Did the Biden campaign direct your strategy with reporters on the statement? Morrell says, so there's an email, which we'll get to, I assume, where I'm telling Nick Shapiro that the campaign would like Shane Harris of the Washington Post, to be the one to get the story. So now we have an acknowledgement that Biden's campaign is saying, here's who you need to release your statement to. Would you acknowledge that that strongly suggests that Blinken's intent was to have this be used in the media to help the Biden campaign?
Rereading it. I clicked off of the page real quick, so I lost it, but I found it.
Page 23.
No, I got it. I assume where I'm telling Nick Shapiro that the campaign would like Shane Harris of the Washington Post to be one to, write the story about this statement. Correct. Let me go ahead and enter that. So that email would be the one that says
I'll read the statement out loud so everyone can hear. You could think about how you're trying to spin this.
I'm not thinking about how I can spin it. I had a twisted T. I'm trying to read.
I will read for the audience. Question: did the Biden campaign direct your strategy with reporters on the statement? Answer: so there is an email, which we'll get to, I assume, where I am telling Nick Shapiro that the campaign would like Shane Harris of the Washington Post to be the ones, to write a story. In other words, yes, the Biden campaign told them who to coordinate with in the media to get this story. I don't know what's so difficult that it's taking you a long while to admit that that's the case.
It's honestly, and you're not gonna accept it because you don't believe shit from anybody, is that I'm trying to listen to you while I'm trying to reread it, but it's two things happening at once. So just give me 2 seconds. And again, like I said, dude, I had a twisted T, so I'm vibing right now. All right, so 1 second. The campaign, your strategy, the statement. So there was an email in which we'll get to, I assume, where I am.
You don't have to read it out loud.
Oh my God, just please let me finish this. I assume where I'm almost done.
Okay, then we'll mute you if you're incapable. We'll watch this fuckhead pretend that he's reading as he's spinning his wheels trying to find a way to spin this.
Washington Post.
Oh, you still reading? Okay. Still reading?
Okay, cool. No. Yeah. I agree that what it says is that allegedly there's an email in which the Biden administration is telling him like that they would like this specific person at the Washington Post to report on the story. Got it. I'm all caught up, bro. I'm a little slow.
So now I'll ask the question again, since you're the slowest person to be able to read this, everyone else had already seen. Will you acknowledge that this means that the Biden campaign was coordinating with the person they reached out to into how they should share this information with the media?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Okay, and would you say that that heavily implies that the reason that they were reaching out was they wanted this to be a talking point to help them in the campaign?
That's where I draw the line. I would say that I would say that there's a I would say that there's a window open for that possibility. Yeah.
Okay. What would the other possibility be?
The other possibility just being that they
Go ahead. Spend some time thinking about this.
I might need to.
I bet you do.
I guess the other possibility would be that they wanted a specific person to just break what information they had, as opposed to the question being, repeat the question again.
Can you come up with a reason other than the Biden team wanted this out there to help them in the campaign, that they would be telling them to coordinate with specific media members? Because let me steel man your position.
Not really. I don't have a position yet. I haven't even answered your question. I would probably agree with you on this. Yes.
Okay, you agree, because I'll steel man what your position was previous to this, where
there was no
could be. Please, I'll just mute you again. Yes. Please, the position would be as follows. Well, maybe Blinken's reaching out not because he's concerned about, quote, helping his side win a campaign, but because he's legitimately concerned about potential Russian interference. Correct? That might be something that you would say.
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay, but then that wouldn't explain coordinating with media. That would explain asking them to coordinate with the FBI or with investigators, but not the media. Once you start talking about, we want this story broken in the media, it's clear that the reason you want this to become public information is you want it to help you in the campaign, which you've agreed to.
And what I would do, and you're not going to afford me that possibility because you just don't trust anybody and you hate the world, is I want to read more of this testimony. I'm glad that you linked it to me because it's interesting.
Okay, so let's go back.
You see how great faith that was, bro. You see that? You see that shit, bro. I know you see it.
I believe I said what would happen was, once I read the evidence to the point where you have no choice but to agree, you will just downplay it and say we should move on. Which is what's going to happen.
No, I didn't say that we should move on. I said I'm glad you linked it to me. I would like to read more. What are you talking about?
Okay, so let's go back up to page 11 now.
Do you understand what's going on? I feel like you're just saying things that I'm not doing. But
all right, so let's go back up to page 10, right?
No. I want to read more. Why don't we just read from that point on?
You can read what you want. I'll let you go. I'll let you go if you want. I'm going to go. So now we know what I wanted to get was, there's two things. That one, Biden's team reached out as part of the effort to get this statement to help them in the campaign. We've acknowledged that. Now, part two was that these people that signed on testified that in part one of their reasons for releasing this information was to help Biden. So from Biden's team's perspective, it was, please help us in the campaign. That's why you've already agreed. That's why they were telling them who to coordinate with in the media. And now I want to get to the part that this was designed by Morell in order to help Biden. Okay? Fair enough. That will sufficiently prove.
Hold on. No. I got a question. I was just reading something. I got a question. So when they said the Biden administration, is there, because you've read this before and you may have forgotten, was there specific individuals within the administration that they're talking about specifically that said that they wanted Shane Harris to write about it? Or the Biden campaign?
Morell says that his memory is hazy, but he does acknowledge several times, his claim is that his only contact from the Biden administration was with Anthony Blinken. So he says it must have been Blinken that he was coordinating with, because that's the only person from the Biden campaign that he had communications with. All right, okay. Now so page 10. Okay. Page 10, question, you were twice acting director of CIA? Answer for Morell, yes. Thank you. You're one of the former 51 Intel officials who signed a public statement regarding Hunter's emails, correct? Yes, he says. I would like to enter a document from October 19th, the public statement. Good. I would also like to enter the political article featured in this public statement from October 19, 2020. Titled, Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former Intel officials say, as Exhibit 2. How would you characterize the public statement? Morrell says, I'm not sure what you mean. How would you describe it? The political article. Oh, we're going to strike that from the record, blah, blah, blah. Morrell finally says, after some redactions, what does it say? Question, yes, describe. What does the statement say? Morrell says, the statement says that we're concerned with suspicious. I think it says deeply suspicious that Russians played some role in the emergence of these emails at a critical time during the election period. Question, what was the intent of the statement? Morrell's answer, there were two intents. One intent was to share our concern with the American people that the Russians were playing on the issue. And two, it was to help Vice President Biden. Would you like me to repeat that?
No, I was wondering if you wanted me to respond to that.
Sure, respond. Is this sufficient proof to you that not only that their intent was at least in part to help Biden?
Yeah, what I would have to do is read this entire thing and look at, what would you say, circumstantial evidence around this, look into who Michael Morrell was, all that stuff, and then I'd be able to come to a solid conclusion. However, this is really good evidence in that supports your argument. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that it's not, because again, unlike you thought, Bestie, I'm good faith. All right.
Okay.
So yeah, I would say that this is very good evidence in your favor.
Okay, you have to look up who Michael Morrell is. What potential evidence do you think that you'll look up into what Michael Morrell is or who he is?
To see if there's any updates to see if there's any updates that follow from when this testimony was given, anything surrounding this entire thing that would maybe add context to this, because you yourself could admit that people have like either perjured themselves or people have said things under oath that you don't necessarily believe. And that's not to say I don't believe this. I right now, because the contesting evidence isn't really there that much, I would fall on believing this more. But again, I'd like to get a whole picture before I decide on something.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second.
Like a hack.
One, will you acknowledge that Michael Morrell was former head of the CIA?
If you say so, I'm going to take that as...
He testified as such. We can go back up and read it once. He was deputy director, As deputy director of the CIA, was responsible for overseeing all the CIA's activities, blah, blah, blah. And you were twice acting director? Yes, he says. So he's at least testifying that he was deputy director of the CIA twice. Twice acting director, Okay,
I don't see any reason why you would lie about that.
You also acknowledge when it says you were one of the 51 former officials who signed a public statement. He says yes. So you know he was former head of the CIA, one of the heads of the CIA, and you know he signed this document, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You also acknowledge that he straight up says that part of his intent was to help Biden, correct?
Not his specific intent, but he believed that the intent of the people that were asking him or trying to influence him to do that was their intent.
No, the question was, what was the intent of the statement that he helped draft? He says, quote, there were two intents. One intent was to share our concern with the American people that the Russians were playing on this issue. And two, it was to help Vice President Biden. His intent was to help Biden.
Okay, hold on. Maybe I do have to reread that, because my understanding when you had first read it, what I had read it, it was that he was saying that other people's intent was to do that, and he was on the bonus. No, you won't want me to read it, so I mean,
go ahead, read away.
Thank you, Bestie. You say, yes, describe what the statement says. The statement says that concerned and suspicious, I think, says deeply suspicious that the Russians played some role in the emergency of the emails at a critical time during the election period. What was the intent of the statement? There were two intents. One intent was to share our concern with the American people. The Russians were playing on an issue. And two, it was to help Vice President Biden. Let me touch on the help President Biden part in a second. We're
going to get to that. I'll read it to you. Yes or no?
Okay, yeah. If we're going to get into that, yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now you acknowledge. Thank you. Now let's go a little further just to clear up any suspicions. Question. Let me touch on the help President Biden part.
Hold on. Where are we?
We're on it's on the screen, page 11. right below, we just got to the point where Morrell says, I had two intents. One was to share a concern with the American people, and second was to help Vice President Biden. Next question.
I was reading from my own link.
Okay. Next question. Let me touch on that help Biden part in a second. In 2020, was the name of one of your Gmail accounts Michael Gmail New? Morrell says, I don't know. Okay, I don't know. Question, what was your role in the creation of this statement? I think Michael Gmail knew. Okay, whatever. What was your role in the creation of this statement? Morrell, I organized it. So this is the guy who's testifying. I organized the statement and then had people sign it. Question, so you drafted that? His response, I did not do the first draft. Question, okay. Morrell says, Mark Polymeropoulos did the first draft. Then I redrafted it. Yeah, I'm the organizer, and I played a major role in drafting it. Question, okay. I would like to enter the draft of the statement of Michael Morrell and Mark Polymeropoulos, whatever his name is, sent to potential signatories, including a request to sign the document dated October 19, 2020 at 1:38 a.m. as Exhibit 2. In other words, this is saying, here's the statement that Michael Morrell and this Mark guy sent to all of these people that signed it, including a request to sign it. That was on October 19, 2020. You acknowledge that's what this is saying.
Yeah, sure, but honestly, I read ahead and I got to the point that you were telling me to.
Question.
He had said that,
question, please. I'm going to read it for the audience. We're going to be very thorough here so that there's no question. Next question. Question, that email was sent from you, correct? Morrell says yes. Question, Michael Gmail New is, Morrell says yes, that's me. Question, perfect. I just want to make sure it's redacted on one of the copies we have. Morrell says, yep. Okay, now the question. Now, I would just like to read. This is from the email that was sent by Morrell to the people that signed it. Mark and I drafted the attached because we believe the Russians were involved in some way in the Hunter Biden email issue, and because we think Trump will attack Biden on the issue at this week's debate, and we want to give the vice president a talking point in response. You said Mark helped you draft the statement. He did the first draft. Correct. And we also have text between you and Mark that will enter. You asked him to create some background points. Yeah. And these texts you believe is great. You said, just wondering if the Russians, let's see. So we can see on this point what he just said there, that he acknowledges we think we want to help Biden in the debate. We think that this is going to come up. You acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Furthermore, page 28. And this was a matter of CIA policy, correct? He responds, it's a matter of secrecy agreement I signed when we first started for the CIA in 1980. It's a lifetime requirement. Question. And in this, you described it as a rush job, this document, to the officials at the CIA. Why? Why were you trying to get this out? Answer. We were trying to get it out before the debate. Question. Before the debate. Yes, ma'am. And okay, the debate was October 22nd, right? This is dated. Yeah, I don't know the date of the debate. You see? You're acknowledging now that this was done. Gates says, and the mechanism you specifically contemplated with a letter useful in winning the election was the upcoming presidential debate, correct? Morrell says, yes, sir. He could not make it more clear. One, we have proof that Blinken reached out to him and said, hey, we want you to put this shit out and coordinate with this specific member of the media, which you have conceded the only possible explanation would be that Blinken wanted this to help Biden. Secondly, we have an admission from Morrell that his intent was to help Biden, in particular, rushing this out before the debate so that Biden could have a talking point in the debate. Will you acknowledge that my characterization of this was correct? That you, when I said that the circumstantial evidence pointed to these 51 officials wanting to help Biden, and that being the motivation for this, not only did the circumstantial evidence strongly suggest that, but this is definitive proof that the person that drafted this and was most responsible intended to do exactly that.
I'm not going to say definitive proof, but I would say you have the strongest argument now because like you've shown the closest thing to source material with a testimony, and I'm not going to not deny testimony. However, it's a very interesting, it's an interesting document, and I didn't know that this existed. So I'm probably going to read all of this real soon and then look at more. Okay,
final point in this. You said, I'm going to steel man here. You said, well, it's not definitive because things could have happened since then. For example, he could have perjured himself. He could have came out and changed his statements. And so therefore, you can't say this is definitive, correct?
those were a list of things. There's probably other things that could make this, like, that could contest this. What a better steel man would be is that you've given me very strong evidence, but I want to continue digging into it to get a holistic picture.
Okay,
That would
but
be
to be clear, I want to get a full list of things that could occur that would make you think that the testimony that you see before you doesn't prove what it claims to prove. So
no, I would like to get further information that either backs up what this says and that contests what this says, so I can cross-reference it myself and come to an independent conclusion.
So one of the things you said was he could have recanted, he could have perjured himself, etc. Correct?
Yeah, that's one of them. But
in other words,
there's probably more to. Go ahead.
Things could have occurred post this that would change your reflection on what this document says.
No. It wouldn't change what this document says. It would change the validity of certain things that were said.
Would change the conclusion you're reaching based on what this document says.
No. What I'm saying is that it could either bolster what the document says, or it can invalidate some of what the document says. I'm not aiming for one or the. I'm not aiming for. Hold on. I'm not aiming for one or the other. It's just that I like to get a holistic vision of everything, the same way that you like to get a holistic vision of everything, because you artistically look at every little thing.
Is your current conclusion based on reading this testimony that until you're provided future evidence that would contradict it, that yes, Blinken did reach out to them, someone from Biden's team did reach out in order to have them craft something that would help them, and yes, they crafted this in order to help? Is that right now what you're assuming is the case?
Yeah, given everything that I have, I am a high 90% sure that that is the case, because that is what it said, and I don't have any information.
So then when I said, so you've reached a conclusion and future evidence, you could read stuff in the future that would change the conclusion you have reached based upon reading this evidence. You're acknowledging that, yes, that is what you're saying, that you could read something that came out, for example, yesterday. Maybe Morrell says, I was pressured to make that statement. They were going to arrest my child. Or maybe Blinken comes out and says, I've never met Morrell.
You said something a little more. You had said something a little more loaded, which I took, which I contested, which is why I wanted to clarify that I said I could find information that either supports this document or that invalidates the document. However, it's on me to be able to look at more information so I have a holistic view, which isn't a bad thing at all.
Do you do the same things when it comes to scandals involving Donald Trump?
Yes, actually.
I don't
like. There you go, man. You don't have to believe me, but I literally
I can prove that
you can't prove. No, you can't prove it. What? Okay, prove it.
What?
Yeah, go ahead.
You came on, and the first thing you talked about with Trump was his memo about Chris Krebs, correct?
Yes.
That was very troubling to you. In fact, that's so troubling that when we're talking about Trump's character flaws, that's the very first outcome that you talked about that resulted from his character flaws.
Yes, that was one of them. Yes.
And yet you didn't do the bare minimum research to even know who Chris Krebs was or what department he headed.
No, I did, and I think I remember earlier when you had asked me that I had forgotten exactly what he headed. I didn't remember the exact name, but it was SISA. Regardless of that fact, we didn't even actually get into my contention with what you said about that because we went down a rabbit hole. Yes, he worked for SISA, but I still think that targeting him with an investigation isn't justified.
Why would you know that? How do you know what more evidence is out there? Have you read transcripts from testimony? Have you?
Hold on. What more evidence is out there for what?
How do you know?
No, I'm asking you what you're asking me. What more evidence is out there for what?
I'm saying that it's entirely possible that Chris Krebs committed crimes, that there is testimony behind the scenes that you haven't seen that Chris Krebs has committed crimes, that new evidence could have broke since the last time you've read about Chris Krebs. You didn't even know when I asked you who Chris Krebs worked for previously, what his role was. You seem to have very little details on it. And yet you were comfortable drawing a conclusion that you thought was the most important thing to lead with that showed the flaws of Donald Trump.
Hold on.
Let me finish my point.
Okay, but I gotta answer one of your 5 questions. What I'm saying
is, it is clear that your standard for proof is massively different when it comes to things that you think suggest that we should be critical of Trump, rather than when it suggests, even when we have direct testimony from the guy who drafted the memo from these 51 former intel officials. Even when he says my intent was to help Joe Biden, you're like, yeah, it seems like that's the case, but I need to read more about it. But you didn't do that with the Chris Krebs shit. You didn't say, actually, it might not be corrupt at all. I don't know. I'll need to read more evidence. You said, nope, it suggests corruption from Donald Trump and a flaw in his character.
Okay, can I answer that with 500 sentences too?
Whatever you feel is necessary.
Okay. Me being 90% certain of something you just showed me is a high bar. So pretending as if I'm just downplaying is like, I'm uncertain, but 90% is a high bar. My information can change at any moment, even with the Chris Krebs situation. But the way that I present what I believe now is going to be based on what I have. What you just showed me led me to a 90% belief. So if I'm talking about this situation, I'm going to lead in a conversation about it with that 90% belief. I'm never 100% certain about everything. I brought up the Chris Krebs thing to talk about it. I didn't say this was definitively the case. The actual conclusions that I reached and the reason why I thought that it was unnecessary was because the memo specifically mentioned that he was targeting him for denying that the election was rigged. That was one of the specific statements that was in the memo. That enough is, for me, in my opinion, to say that's unjust if that's one of the reasons you're going after him.
For the record, the reason we went down this rabbit hole was it was a surface level of like showing the double standard and how these things occurred. It came from a conversation with Chris Krebs and censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story. But you wanted to talk more about, you even said specifically, I want to talk about Krebs. I want to talk about the 51 former officials. So I've definitively proved my case about the officials. But when you say we're going down these rabbit holes, it wasn't me that took us there, it was you. You're the one who didn't want to talk about Krebs anymore. True. You wanted to talk about these officials. I proved my case. I'll give you the final word.
That's not true. When you say that the reason why we go down those rabbit holes is because of the thing. We started out at the Chris Krebs thing, and then you brought us down to all these rabbit holes, and I said, let's talk about specifically one of those, and I chose the intel thing. I wanted to talk about Chris Krebs, but you brought up 500 different things stemming from that, and I said, okay, let's slow down and choose one of these things. So pretending that I'm the one that brought us down those rabbit holes when you ranted and got us down those rabbit holes is way more bad faith than anything I've done in this conversation. You're still my bestie, though.
All right, we'll see.